Chapter 20 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Rover Explains. "It's a lie," repeated Constance, seeing that Preless did not say a word. "Dolly is a little cruel fool who tyrannizes to the full extent of his weak powers. But I don't believe that he killed Agstone." "Well," drawled Preless reflectively, "on the face of it there appears to be no reason. And yet this sham frock is in this rubbish cupboard." "Dolly can explain," breathed Mrs. Rover hopefully. "Can he explain why he entered Ned's flat to—" He didn't! It's impossible, I tell you." "Constance," declared the other seriously, "you said yourself that Mr. Rover would be glad to see Ned dead, out of sheer jealousy. I quite believe that, and I believe also that he had not the pluck to kill him. But he did his best to get Ned into trouble." "By killing Agstone? What rubbish!" cried Mrs. Rover feverishly. "If he killed the one, he would have murdered the other, and would have chosen Ned in preference." "Humph! Perhaps with a refinement of cruelty Rover wished Ned to be hanged and so slaughtered Agstone in the hope that Ned would be accused. And accused Ned would have been," cried Preless decisively, "but that I brought in your guest to see him helpless." Mrs. Rover twisted her hands in her hair. "It's impossible, I tell you," she lamented, hoping against hope. "Dolly is a fool. He never would be a murderer. He hasn't the plunk. Heaven knows that I have no cause to love him, and that he stands in the way of my happiness. But I tell you, Dory, that I would have cut off my right hand sooner than have brought you in here to spy out his shame." "I am glad to hear you say that, Constance," returned Preless quietly, "for it shows that you have honor, if not love, and that, even to secure your happiness with Ned, you will not stoop to injure the man who is your husband. But think, my dear girl, is it not better that I should find this than Jadby?" "Jadby? The man who loves Mona? What has he got to do with it?" "Everything," said Preless tersely. "He wishes to secure Mona as his wife and will stop at nothing. You may wonder how I came to guess that your husband's dressing room was in this flat, and how I came to know that this sham dress was hidden behind these clothes. I can explain very shortly. I consulted Madame Marie Epingrave." "That fortune teller?" gasped Constance, staring. "I have consulted her myself, and she told me a lot of rubbish. Surely you do not believe what she says in that shoddy room of hers." "I am bound to believe," said Preless dryly, "seeing that the domino with the attached frock front is here, as she stated. But she may not have told me so by means of occult power, in spite of her claim to exercise the same. In some earthly way, I know not how, she knew where this," he touched the domino, "was to be found. She will tell Captain Jadby, to whom she is much attached, and then he will come here to make what trouble he can. Therefore you can understand that it is better for Rover that I should be the discoverer." "Yes, I see," murmured Constance, and tottered towards a chair to fall into it. "Oh, horrible, horrible! But there must be some explanation, Dory. Think of one! Think of one!" Women, as Preless reflected at the moment, were most extraordinary. Here was a wife who avowedly hated a husband of the trickery, effeminate sort, yet when chance placed a weapon against him in her hand, she refused to use it, despite the temptation of thus ridding herself forever of a marital incubus. Rover had practically killed her father. He had cheated her into a match which she loathed, and he was doing his best to make her unhappy. In the face of it all, his deceived wife defended him, and this against the strong desire which she had for the man who truly loved her. Truly, women were strange. However, it was not Preliss's business to analyze Mrs. Rover's feelings. What he had to do was to learn the meaning of Rover's hiding the domino in his cupboard, and this he proceeded to do. "Was Jadby at your ball?" he asked abruptly. "I never asked him. I don't know him," she replied, clasping her hands tightly. "But you know that owing to the masks, many people, shady people too, were there. Captain Jadby might have come also." "He did come," said Preliss quickly, "for he was one of the first to unmask when seeing Ned insensible, and to blame me. Certainly he may have come up the stairs opportunely, but since he wore a domino and mask, I am sure that he was at the ball." "What color was the domino?" "Blue, light blue," rejoined Preliss promptly. "There were many blue dominoes," murmured Constance. "I wonder why this man came to my ball." "Ah, that is what we have to find out. But another question." Preliss cleared his throat. "Presuming, as we must, that your husband wore this made-up thing, did he know what you would wear?" "Yes," assented Mrs. Rover, then started up with a cry and a very pale face. "Oh, Dory, Dory! Are you going to say that my dress was imitated by him, so that I might be accused?" "It looks like it," said Preliss reluctantly. "What else could he say?" "But I can't believe that Dolly would be so wicked," said the poor wife anxiously. "And yet the dress is the same. There is only a front, to be sure, but when worn anyone would have mistaken him for me. A man always looks taller in women's clothes." "These are hardly women's clothes." "Sufficiently like them to deceive anyone. But you said that you spoke to someone wearing a dress like mine. It was not me, Dory. I should have remembered. Was it Dolly?" "I never spoke to you or to anyone dressed like you," said Preliss quickly. "I only told you that to get at the truth. But I never expected to hear you say that you had worn the dress. One thing I may tell you," he added, "that the green domino seemed to be ubiquitous. I saw him, presuming your husband is the person, talking and drinking and dancing all over the place." "I was dancing also," said Constance. "And if Dolly wore a similar dress, it is natural that you should see the frock and domino often. Dolly received my guests unmasked, you know." "I remember, but later he vanished, and then might have—" Preliss touched the domino significantly. "Still, there is one thing to be said," he added. "How did your husband enter Ned's flat?" "Don't you remember?" she said, raising her head. "Agstone brought in the lady, Dolly, I suppose, when Ned was in that cataleptic state." "I forgot that. But who admitted Agstone? What is the matter?" He asked this because Constance rose suddenly to her feet with a cry of astonishment. "Mr. Hakin was at the ball," she said, alarmed. "I know. I saw him. That is, I recognized him by his chuckle. Well?" Mrs. Rover sat down again. "You know that Mr. Hakin is my godfather," she remarked, and when Preliss nodded, went on. "He was much distressed over my preference for Ned, seeing that I was married, and came to remonstrate with me on the night of the ball." Said Preliss coolly. "I wondered why he was at the ball. A most unusual festivity for a dry-as-dust old man like Uncle Simon to be at." "I gave him the key," said Constance in a low voice. "The key? What key?" "The key of Ned's flat." "Constance, how did you become possessed of the key?" With a bent head and a hurried low voice, she explained. "Dolly was very cruel to me at times. He even struck me, and I could not strike back at a little rat like that. I told Ned, who was furious and wanted to frighten Dolly. I prevented him, so that there might be no scandal. Ned then gave me the key of his flat. He had an extra key, and told me if Dolly ever struck me again to come to him. I should not have thought of doing so, but to quieten Ned I consented to take the key." "What an injudicious thing to do," breathed Preless, alarmed. "If your husband knew, he might do a lot of damage. But how did Uncle Simon get the key out of you?" "I told him about it the night of the ball. He got me into a quiet corner to remonstrate, so I explained everything. Mr. Haken was angry at Ned for having given me the key." "He was quite right," interposed Preless. "Ned ought to have had more sense than to do such a mad thing. Go on." "Mr. Haken insisted upon having the key, and then said that he would go down and see Ned." Preless turned suddenly pale. Was this what Horace had warned him against when he advised him to leave the case alone? "Did Uncle Simon go?" he asked in a stifled voice. "I don't know. He certainly said that he would go down and give Ned back the key, and talk to him about his folly in letting me have it." Preless felt uncomfortable, and his thoughts flew to his aunt with her merry ways. It would be terrible for Lady Sophia if Haken were involved in this dreadful case, and indeed if he were, as seemed apparent from Constance's story, Preless wished that he had taken the doctor's advice and had left it well alone. While he was puzzling over this new problem and trying to find reasons against his uncle's complicity, he heard Constance cry out and looked up to see Rover standing in the doorway. The little stockbroker, dressed to perfection and overdressed at that, looked more dapper and neat than ever. His face was more colorless, his eyes more plaintive and blue than they had been in the artificial light in which he had received his wife's guests. Such a mean-looking, bloodless man could scarcely get into a rage. Yet a venomous look crept into his eyes as he surveyed his wife and her visitor. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, trying to assume the dignity of an injured husband, which sat very badly on him. Before Constance could speak, Lord Preless stepped forward with the domino over his arm and spread it out. "This is the meaning of my being in your dressing room, Mr. Rover," he said sharply and perfectly cool. "I found this behind some clothes in yonder cupboard." "How dare you search into my private affairs?" cried Dolly, standing on tiptoe and growing red. "Is it not better that I should do so than the police, Mr. Rover?" The little man looked genuinely puzzled. "The police? What do you mean by mentioning the police?" "This dress, this domino, both are an imitation of the dress and domino which your wife wore at the ball. And the lady who was introduced by Agstone to make Shepworth insensible, if you remember the case, was arrayed in this way." Instead of turning pale, Dolly became redder than ever and turned like a snake on his wife. "You," he said savagely, "you entered Shepworth's flat. You dared to—" "I never was near the flat," said Constance, coming very close to him and looking down contemptuously from her great height. "And if you dare to hint at such a thing, I shall leave you forever. I have put up with enough from you. Don't drive me too far." "Mr. Rover has enough to do to defend himself without troubling you, Constance," said Preless quietly. Dolly started. "What do you mean?" he asked nervously. "This sham dress was hidden in your cupboard." "I never saw it before. I didn't know it was there," Dolly gasped, for he was beginning to scent danger. "The presumed woman introduced by Agstone was dressed in this," went on Lord Preless mercilessly. "You hated Shepworth. You wished to get him into trouble, and so—" Preless stopped. "I leave you to draw your own inferences," he ended. Dolly trembled, as well he might, for the visitor had drawn up a very good case against him. "I tell you I never saw the dress before," he quavered. "And how did you find it?" "That is neither here nor there," said Preless, wishing to shield Constance from the mean wrath of the little man. "Later on the police can explain." "The police? The police?" Dolly grew as white as a sheet. Constance laid her hand on his shoulder. "Don't be afraid, Dolly. I do not believe that you killed that man Agstone." Dolly brushed her hand away with the snarl of a terrified cat. "Keep yourself to yourself," he snapped, showing his teeth. "You hate me, so you need not defend me." "I don't love you," answered Constance bitterly. "I have small cause to, considering the way in which you tricked me. All the same, I do not wish to see you get into trouble over a crime which I truly believe you had not pluck enough to commit." "You were quite right," retorted her husband shamelessly. "I never did have pluck enough to kill a fly, much less a human being. I should have stabbed your lover long ago if I had." "Shepworth is not Mrs. Rover's lover," said Preless quietly. "He is. She is always howling after him," taunted the venomous little man. "But she sold herself to me and—" "And you did not pay the price," said Constance, scornful and still. "No," Dolly chuckled. "I got the better of you there. But you are my wife now, and I'll make you pay. Shepworth can marry that criminal girl whenever he likes. I hope he will, so as to torment you." Mrs. Rover's eyes flashed. "Ned shall never marry—" she began, when Preless made a sign to her to keep the secret of the new engagement, and spoke himself, coldly and sternly. "Miss Trent's character has been perfectly cleared by her acquittal, Mr. Rover, and if you dare say a word against her, I shall throw you out of the window." "How brave you are in defending Shepworth's bride," said Dolly, wincing at the flash in Preliss's blue eyes. "I am," replied the other, not contradicting the mistake under which he saw Dolly labored. "But as yet you have not proved your innocence." "There is no need to prove it." Rover's voice whimpered unsteadily. "It is ridiculous to accuse me." "This dress was hidden in your cupboard," insisted Preless. "What of that? This room was used as a place for the coats and hats of the men who came to the ball. Any one of them might have hidden the domino and frock there. I did not. I received my guests unmasked, and afterwards put on a black silk domino." "Ah!" Preless took a step forward. "Then it was you who appeared in Shepworth's dining room, and who gave the alarm." "Yes, it was me. I came down to see Shepworth, and to make it plain to him that he was not to make love any longer to my wife." "He never did make love since our marriage," flashed out Constance with scorn. "Ned has been true to honor, as I have been." Preless raised a hand to stop a promising quarrel between the ill-matched couple. "Only you, Rover, knew what kind of dress your wife was to wear at the ball," he said judicially. "Only you could have had a similar one made, so as to get her into trouble, I expect." "Another person knew," cried Dolly, with a flash of triumph in his china blue eyes. "Yes, I asked Hakin to come to the ball to remonstrate with Constance about her love for Shepworth. He is godfather to Constance, as you know. I was aware that Constance would try to dodge Hakin, as she didn't want to be scolded, so I described her dress to him that there might be no mistake. Hakin was at the ball, Lord Preless. Why don't you accuse him?" The young man sneered, although he felt distinctly nervous at the many proofs accumulating against his uncle. "Hakin had no reason to get Shepworth into trouble. You had." "Nothing would have pleased me better, but I should have stopped short of putting my neck into a noose, and I did. I tell you again that I don't know how that domino frock thing came to be in my cupboard, that I never entered Shepworth's flat, as I certainly could not do so without a key, and that I was the man in the black silk domino who gave the alarm. And when I entered the flat then, you had left the door open." All this explanation was perfectly natural, and Dolly gave it with such an air of truth that Preless was reluctantly obliged to believe him. The young man threw the domino over his shoulder and moved to the door. "I shall take this with me," he said curtly. "And see the police?" asked Rover with twinkling eyes. "No, not at present." "Not at any time if you value your uncle's liberty." "What do you mean?" Preless faced round sharply. "I mean nothing, as I know nothing. But there is as much evidence against Hakin as against me, and if you accuse me, I shall accuse him. How will Lady Sophia like a scandal of that sort?" "Eh?" Preless turned away without vouchsafing a reply. "I shall see you again, Constance," he said coldly. "You shall not see her until Shepworth marries Mona Chint," snapped the venomous little husband, "and I shall move heaven and earth to bring that about." "You will need to," retorted Preless, remembering his engagement and thinking how angry Dolly would be when he learned the truth. "And let me tell you, Rover, that if you ill-treat your wife, I shall make it my business to thrash you." Dolly drew back and snarled, but seemed distinctly afraid. Preless, with a nod to the unhappy wife, passed from the room and out of the flat. He felt distinctly nervous about Simon Hakin. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A possible scandal. After all, Lord Preless did not return to Hyde on that night, much as he desired to. In view of this new complication, which threatened the domestic peace of Lady Sophia Hakin, her nephew decided to remain in London and give all his energies towards solving the problem. He could not think that Hakin had anything to do with the murder of Agstone. In the first place, he had no reason to kill the man. In the second, he did not possess any leaves of the sacred herb with which to make Shepworth unconscious. Certainly it was Agstone who had kindled the leaves in the bronze cup, but he must have obtained them from Mr. Hakin, presuming he was the disguised lady, since he could have obtained them in no other way. Sir Oliver had possessed a portion of the plant, but had used it in the library when he was murdered. So the old sailor could not have procured the leaves in that direction. Preless began to wonder if Hakin had got the leaves from Madame Marie Epengrave to execute his purpose. But then, so far as Preless knew, his uncle was not acquainted with the Bond Street fortuneteller. And again, he was well acquainted with Dr. Horace, who admitted to possession of the leaves, and more than this, had actually burnt the sacred herb in the New Bailey. Lord Preless decided first to call upon his uncle in the city and lay the facts discovered before him, and then to interview Dr. Horace. In these two several ways he might get at the truth. Also, somewhat later, he decided to again speak with Madame Marie, and if possible see her in the presence of Captain Jadby. When the buccaneer learned that Mona was engaged to another man, and that she had inherited the property, he might bow to fate and leave things alone. Finally, Preless knew that he had a powerful ally in the fortune-teller. From what he had seen of her strong-willed character, he guessed that she would stick at nothing to secure as her husband the man with whom she was infatuated. Bearing all these circumstances in mind, Preless sent a wire to Mona, stating that business retained him in London, and also went to his club to write his first love letter. In this he carefully refrained from mentioning the case, and merely poured out his heart in a passionate dithyramb in honor of his goddess. Mona, for the moment, felt some disappointment when she noted the absence of information regarding Madame Marie, but later confessed that her lover was right. It would never have done for the first letter which had passed between them to be soiled by the sordid tragedy in which she had been implicated. All the same, much as she appreciated Preliss's slightly turgid prose, her heart hungered to learn of his doings relative to the case. She felt that she would not know a happy moment until the truth were made manifest. Then she could become Lady Preliss with a light heart. The next day Preliss went into the city to see his uncle and learned that Mr. Hakin had gone to Paris for a few days. He was expected back on the morrow, as he already had been absent for some time, so all that his eager nephew could do was to possess his soul in patience. Preliss returned to his club rather disappointed, and there found a telegram waiting for him. It had been sent to his Hyde Hotel and had been repeated on to his club, since it was marked urgent. It proved to be from Horace and asked Preliss to come up at once. "Be at my house at 3 in the afternoon. Important," said the wire. "I wonder what this means," Preliss asked himself uneasily, and fretted over the matter until the time came for him to go to Rutland Square. There was no getting over the fact that the mystery of this case was telling on Preliss's strong nerves. Nor was his uneasiness diminished when he found that Dr. Horace was not alone. With him were Captain Jadby and Madame Marie Eppengrave, both of whom appeared to be on very good terms with their host. As usual, the room was untidy with its litter of curiosities, but Preliss managed to find a seat with his back to the light. This he did so as to keep his face well in the shade, as he had a premonition that there was about to be a duel of words. Indeed, the first whispered remark of Horace hinted at a storm about to break. "You silly ass," grumbled the doctor in his beard, as he went forward to welcome his guest. "Why couldn't you leave things alone as I told you? Now all the fat is on the fire with a vengeance." Preliss shrugged his shoulders with a carelessness which he was far from feeling, and saluted Madame Marie with a bow. Of Captain Jadby, who stood fidgeting by the window, he took no notice. The buccaneer noticed the omission and resented it. "English manners, I suppose," sneered the half-caste pointedly. Preliss sat down calmly and took up the challenge. "Considering our last meeting, when you treacherously fired on my friend, you can hardly expect me to behave courteously." "I wish I had killed him," flashed out Jadby viciously. "I quite believe that, but you did not harm him in the least," retorted Preliss, lying bravely to defend Ned and to annoy the captain. "I wounded him in the arm," snarled Jadby. "Didn't I, Marie?" "I certainly saw that Mr. Shepworth was slightly hurt," replied the fortune teller. "In a trance, of course." "Ah," replied Preliss negligently, "your trances are not always reliable, madam." "I think you have found that this one is, at least," she replied in her turn, and very significantly. "What does Captain Jadby think?" asked Preliss genially. He felt sure that the woman had not dared to risk the buccaneer's rage by explaining what she had said. "Madame Marie told me that she went into a trance on your account," said Jadby, taking a chair sullenly. "But of course she did not remember what she said, and could not explain to me." "Since Madame is certain that this especial trance is reliable," was Preliss's retort, "she must remember something." "Oh, the deuce take your chatter!" shouted Horace, ruffling his shaggy red hair in a high state of irritation. "I didn't ask you here to waste my time in dribble." "In that case, as my time is also valuable, I had better go." "No, no, confound you," said Horace crossly, and seeing that Preliss knew well how to treat his humors. "Madam here and Jadby wish to speak to you seriously." "I fail to see upon what subject." "Upon the subject of Miss Chint," cried the buccaneer savagely. "I decline to discuss an absent lady," said Prelus coolly. "You are engaged to her." "Am I indeed? But you shan't marry her." "Won't I? See here." Prelus rose, very tall and very straight and very cool-headed. "If you persist in going on like this, Captain Jadby, I shall be compelled to twist your neck." "English manners," sneered the half-caste again. "Not at all. Colonial manners. South Sea manners, if you will, and very necessary manners for dealing with a ruffian such as you are." "I'll kill you for this," muttered Jadby, sinking back into his chair. "With your little gun?" taunted Prelus pleasantly. "I hope you'll shoot straighter. I never saw so rotten a shot." "I can do more than shoot." "Yes, you can bark. And bite, too. See here, I ask you here to tell you, in the presence of Horace, that if you don't stop meddling with things which do not concern you, I'll disgrace your uncle." Prelus never winced. He had a kind of idea that something of this sort was forthcoming, and merely laughed aggravatingly. "Which uncle?" said he, calmly. "I have two or three." "Mr. Simon Hakin." "Oh, indeed." Prelus turned to Horace. "Are you on my side, or on the side of these blackmailers?" he demanded. Madame Marie arose furiously. "I am not a blackmailer," she cried, and her deep-toned voice became shrill with anger. "I did not want to say anything, and if Felix does not swear to give up this girl, I shall refuse to speak out." "No!" snapped Jadby with a fierce glance, at which, strange to say, the courageous woman looked cowed. "You shall speak as I direct." "Are you on my side or theirs?" Prelus asked Horace again. "On yours, hang you!" snarled the ugly little man. "And if I were not, you would find yourself in Queer Street, I can tell you." Prelus took no notice of this outburst, but turned to the woman. "Are you against me?" he demanded. "I am neutral," she retorted uneasily. "I see. And Jadby, there is an open enemy. Well, now that I understand the situation, perhaps you will let me know how Mr. Hakin can be disgraced by you two, or you three." "We can accuse him of murder," said Jadby, choking with anger at the exasperating coolness of the young aristocrat. "Good. Go on." "Of two murders," spat out the half-caste. "Better and better. Ha! I understand then that you, Captain Jadby, and you, Madame Marie, accuse Mr. Hakin of killing Sir Oliver Landwin and Steve Agstone?" "Yes," snapped the captain. "And yes," breathed the woman, very pale. Prelus looked quietly at them. "Prove these charges," he said. "One moment," said Dr. Horace, getting out his German pipe. "Remember, Prelus, that this business is none of my bringing about. I warned you against meddling in the case, and you would not take my warning. You have only yourself to thank for what is coming." "I am perfectly ready to take the responsibility of my actions," was the stiff retort of the young man, and he turned to Jadby. "Go on." The captain, bursting with venom, was only too pleased to relieve himself in a torrent of words. "Before my father, Sir Oliver, died, he frequently talked to me about the estate, sought my counsel, in fact. I thus learned that Mr. Hakin, although supposed to be a wealthy man, was in difficulties owing to disastrous speculation. He asked Sir Oliver to lend him £50,000 to tide over a crisis, and this my father refused to do. Naturally, Mr. Hakin was very angry." "Probably," put in Prelus coolly. "But what you say does not prove that Mr. Hakin killed Sir Oliver." "Let me speak now," said Horace rapidly. "I was the sole possessor of the sacred herb, which, if you remember, Prelus, I brought from Easter Island. I gave some to Hakin, who desired to get the same for Sir Oliver. You see," pursued the traveler, "Hakin knew that Landwin was much interested in occult studies. so thought to tempt him to lend the necessary 50,000 pounds by getting him this rare herb, which, as you know, produces a trance." "I see." Preless nodded. "Then Mr. Haken confessed to you that he desired the loan of this money?" "He did, saying that his affairs were in a bad way. With the gift of the sacred herb he hoped to soften Sir Oliver's heart, which was somewhat hard where money matters were concerned." "I never knew that Mr. Haken was aware of Lanywyn's inclination to the occult," said Preless quietly. "He was in a way," said Madame Marie suddenly, and taking up the story. "But of course I told him more, being very friendly with Sir Oliver, as you know. Mr. Haken was superstitious himself, as the saying goes, and frequently consulted me about stocks and shares." "What?" Preless looked incredulous. "Do you mean to tell me that a hard-headed man like Mr. Haken consulted you?" "He did, and I was enabled to serve him by my powers. I understood, Lord Preless, that you believed in the occult world." "I do," rejoined the young man dryly, "because I have had considerable experience and possess imagination. But Mr. Haken—" "He believed also," interrupted the fortune teller quickly, "and came to me for advice. It was I who recommended him to apply to his old friend Sir Oliver for the 50,000 pounds. When Sir Oliver refused, I told Mr. Haken that he should get some of the sacred herb from Dr. Horace, and give it to Sir Oliver, in the hope that the gift would make Sir Oliver hand over the money." "How did you know that Dr. Horace had the herb?" asked Preless sharply. "Madame Marie and I were acquainted in Samoa," put in the traveler, "and when we met in London I told her that I had succeeded in getting the famous trance herb of Easter Island. She asked me for some of the leaves to use in her business, and I declined." "Why, when you gave the same to Sir Oliver?" inquired Preless. "Because I wished to keep the herb to myself," said Horace, his rugged face growing dark. "But when Haken asked me for it to get money out of Lanywyn, I gave it readily. I hated Lanywyn. He thwarted me in Tahiti, it matters not how, and he treated my brother Steve like a dog. I knew that Haken would lose the 50,000, and wished Lanywyn to see the last of the cash. I would have ruined Lanywyn if I could." "This is quite a new light on your character, Horace," said Preless, with uplifted eyebrows. "However, I understand that for your own purposes, which you have so kindly set forth, you gave the herb to Lanywyn." "Not personally," retorted the doctor, scowling. "I gave it to Haken, and he passed it to Madame Marie. And it was I who presented the herb to Sir Oliver, after retaining some leaves for my own use," said the woman coolly. "It was on the night of the murder that Mr. Haken came down to see Sir Oliver." "Can you swear to that?" demanded Preless, watching her. "I can," she assured him emphatically. "Mr. Haken knew that I was to give the herb to Sir Oliver on that night, and came down so as to strike the iron while it was hot, by explaining how he had procured the herb from Dr. Horace. Mr. Haken came in quietly by the window, when I was conversing with Sir Oliver in the library. That was about 9 o'clock. Agstone entered to close the windows. They were not shuttered, remember? And also saw Mr. Haken. At 5 minutes after 9, if you recollect the evidence I gave in court, I went to bed, leaving Mr. Haken alone with Sir Oliver." She paused. "And then?" questioned Preless. "There is nothing more to say," she replied coldly. "Mr. Haken was in the library with a man from whom he desired to get money. It was, I believe, refused, and then Mr. Haken murdered Sir Oliver, afterwards burning the sacred herb about the time Miss Trent entered the room. Needless to say, before she entered, Mr. Haken had gone." "A very pretty story," said Preless, quite unmoved. "That is one crime, no doubt, but the other?" "I can explain," said Jadby, enraged at the young man's coolness. From Madame Marie, I learned that Mr. Haken was going to Mrs. Rover's ball to see his goddaughter and Shepworth, and—" "How did you know that?" asked Preless, turning to the woman. "Mrs. Rover consulted me occultly about her marriage, and confessed, amongst other things, that Mr. Haken was her godfather. I saw that Mrs. Rover was in that reckless state which might lead to a scandal, and I told everything to Mr. Haken. He resolved to go to the masked ball and remonstrate with Mrs. Rover, and afterwards with Mr. Shepworth. I told Captain Jadby." "And I went there," said the captain quickly, "because I knew that Haken had killed Sir Oliver and wished to see him in order to get some money." "To blackmail him, in fact," said Preless coolly. "So you were the continental individual whom my uncle was to meet." "Yes, but he was too clever for me. He came in an ordinary domino and afterwards changed to a green one with a dress similar to that of Mrs. Rover's." "How can you be sure?" "Because I was hunting for Mr. Haken and heard him chuckle. For the moment I fancied that he was Mrs. Rover owing to the dress, but when he chuckled I guessed it was Mr. Haken. He eluded me, however, but not before I had smelt the perfume of the tuberose which the sacred herb gives out. When you discovered the crime, Lord Preless, I guessed that Mr. Haken, disguised as Mrs. Rover, so as to implicate her with Shepworth, should there be trouble, had gone down and murdered Agstone." "How did Agstone come there? How did Mr. Haken know he would be there?" Jadby leaned back coolly. "I cannot answer either of those questions," he said calmly. "Perhaps Mr. Haken can." There was a few moments of silence, which Preless broke. "Well," he asked, rising, "and what are your terms for silence?" "You must give up Miss Trent to me," said the captain with a glance of gratification, for he fancied that Preless was yielding. "I shall marry her, and then we shall live at the Grange." "Ah, but you see it will not be your property," said Preless politely. Jadby sprang to his feet. "Not my property?" "No. I fear that Dr. Horace has not informed you that Agstone brought the will, leaving everything to Miss Trent to him, and that he has restored it to the lady." "You are a pauper, Captain Jadby. Miss Trent has the money, and shortly she will have me as her husband." Jadby took scarcely any notice of Preless, important as was the matter he talked about. "Horace!" he cried, glaring viciously. "You have played me false." "I never intended to play you true," said Horace contemptuously. "Then I shall ruin Haken," cried Jadby, at his wits' end with sheer rage. "Do so," said Preless, walking to the door. "I decline to be blackmailed. Good day." And he walked out. After him came Madame Marie before he could descend the stairs. She gripped him by the arm earnestly, and looked into his face. Preless could hear the captain and Horace quarreling desperately in the room he had left, but waited patiently until the woman spoke. "Swear to me," panted Madame Marie, "that Jadby will never, never marry that girl, and I will help you." "In what way?" "For one thing, I shall stop Felix from denouncing your uncle." "Pooh! That's bluff." "Indeed it isn't," said the woman passionately. "What I have told you is perfectly true. Your uncle will be in great danger if Felix speaks. But swear to save him from that girl, and I shall stop all trouble about Mr. Haken." "I swear," said Preless quietly, "especially as it is the dearest wish of my life to make Miss Trent my wife." "Beware! Oh, be careful!" implored Madame Marie, clinging to Preless. "I know that Felix is desperate. He is dangerous." "I am not afraid of him. He cannot hurt me." "But he may hurt her," cried Madame Marie. "If anything goes wrong, come to me. I can help you." "I shall do so. But why do you work against the man you love?" "Because I can secure him in no other way." I want him to leave England to marry me. While he stops here and is infatuated with Miss Chint, there is no hope. Hark! Felix is calling. Remember, we are outwardly enemies, but inwardly friends. You promise." On this she produced a small golden crucifix. Considering the exigencies of the case, Preless was willing to promise anything, even to a doubtfully good woman, such as Madame Marie appeared to be. But the production of the crucifix took him aback. "I give you my word," he said stiffly. "I want your oath," she retorted. "Swear on this, to aid me to marry Felix, or I do nothing." There was no help for it, and Preless had to make allowance for Madame Marie's flamboyant, foreign way of exaggeration. "I swear to help you," he said, and kissed the crucifix. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Unexpected. "Don't talk nonsense to me," cried Lady Sophia, rapping the dinner table with her lorgnette. "The idea is too ridiculous for words. To marry a girl out of jail. Monstrous. Your father would turn in his grave, and he wasn't very particular." Lord Preless was dining with his lively relative when this speech was made at the tail end of a very excellent meal. Hakin had duly returned from Paris on the day after the interview of Preless with Dr. Horace and his two friends. On finding a note from his nephew stating that he desired to speak on an important subject, Mr. Hakin had responded with a wire inviting the young man to dinner. Lady Sophia had also arrived in town from Folkestone and explained to Preless, when he appeared, that she would do nothing for Mona. This remark led to a request for explanations, which Lady Sophia was only too anxious to afford, and the presence of footman and butler at the dinner table alone kept her from raging at Preless all the time he was eating. Hakin, looking more dried up than ever, sat at the foot of the table. His wife invariably took the top, and chuckled at intervals. He had not yet heard what Preless wished to speak about, and was waiting until Lady Sophia retired to the drawing-room, a thing she seemed disinclined to do at present, so rabid was she against her nephew. Having made the above remark, she waited for a reply. But as Preless merely crumbled what was left of his bread and said nothing, she launched out again with a peremptory question. "Do you or do you not wish your father to turn in his grave?" "My dear aunt," replied Preless very distinctly, "I wish the corpse to take the position it finds the most comfortable." "Oh!" cried Lady Sophia, outraged in her deepest feelings. "Oh, that I should live to hear my late brother called an it! Have you no reverence, Preless?" "Not so much reverence as I have patience," he replied, very bored. "Ah!" Lady Sophia hugged herself. "I might have expected that. You never, never will face the truth." "What is the truth?" asked Hakin, his eyes twinkling and putting the question of Pilate. "The truth," said his wife majestically, "is that Preless must have been changed at nurse. He has not the feelings of his ancestors." "I have their gout, however," said Preless humorously. "What possible objection can you have to my marrying, Aunt Sophia?" "It's not the marriage itself I object to, Preless, but to the bride you choose. You know that well." "There won't be a prettier bride in the three kingdoms than Mona." "I am quite sure there won't," said his aunt spitefully, "if she only gets as far as the altar." "The communion rails, you mean. I'll do my best to bring her there." "Not in my presence, Preless." "All right, we'll have a quiet wedding." "A quiet wedding!" raged Lady Sophia. "And with such a notorious girl as the bride, why, all the—" "Aunt Sophia," interrupted Preless, growing restive under these insults, "permit me to remind you that Miss Trent is to be my wife, and that I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." Lady Sophia rose and swept to the door. "I'm sorry for you. I am truly sorry for you," she said with scorn, and throwing back her head. "Thank you," replied her nephew meekly and politely, holding open the door. "The same to you and many of them." "Oh, Preless, how I would love to box your ears!" And unable to say anything worse, Lady Sophia disappeared in a royal rage. Preless did not feel very amiable himself for having been baited unnecessarily, and closed the door with a bang which said volumes. Then he returned to the disordered dinner table, poured himself out a glass of port, caught his uncle's twinkling eyes, and laughed in spite of his irritation. Hakin nodded approvingly. "That's better than banging the door," he said, stretching his legs in a genial fashion. "Have a cigar?" Preless accepted one of the best and lighted up, while his host followed his example. When the blue smoke was curling round the old head and the young, and the glasses were full, they dismissed the trouble of Lady Sophia by common consent. Hakin looked interrogatively at the young man. "Well," he demanded quietly, "and what have you to say to me? If I know anything of young men, you wish to borrow money," and ended with a chuckle at his joke, knowing the wealth of his nephew. "And if I know anything of old men," said Preless coolly, "I should advise them to borrow from their relatives instead of from strangers." Hakin was somewhat startled by this speech, which was as rude a one as Preless could well have made. But he felt irritable, and wished to smash rather than break the ice. "What are you talking about?" asked the elder man cautiously. "About £50,000. "A very tidy little sum," said Hakin, quite composed. "I required that precise sum myself a month or so ago, to tide over a crisis." "Did you get it?" "Not from Oliver Lanwin," retorted the city man dryly. Preless jumped up from his chair and let his cigar fall. He was far from expecting that Hakin would own up so quickly. Leaning forward, he placed his hands on the table and looked straight into the withered face before him. "What do you mean?" "Don't burn the carpet with your cigar," said Hakin irreverently. And when Preless stooped to pick it up, he continued, "I should rather ask you that, my boy. You know something, or else you wouldn't talk of my borrowing, and of the exact sum which I required." "I know a great deal," said the young man, and sat down. Hakin settled himself luxuriously in his chair. "Let us hear all about it, my boy," said he. "Is your glass filled? Your cigar all right? Good. Fire away. I'm in a mood for listening." "Are you in the mood to face danger?" questioned the other man, astonished at this coolness. Hakin wrinkled his brows as a monkey does. "Danger?" he repeated. "And from whom?" "From Madame Marie, from Captain Jadby, and from Dr. Horace." "I agree as to the first two," said Hakin, perfectly calm, "but I am sure that the last named will not harm me in any way." Preless reflected. "You are right," he said thoughtfully. "Horace is your friend and mine, but the others—" "Yes, I know all about the others," interrupted Hakin in a level voice. "They have their own fish to fry, and are not particular how big a blaze they make to fry them. Of course I expected you would find out." "Did you? And why?" "Why?" Hakin pushed back his chair and rose with a chuckle. "Didn't Sophia inveigle you into helping young Shepworth and the girl he was engaged to? You could scarcely do that and not cross my trail." "Why didn't you confess to me?" asked Prelus, much vexed. "Confess what? That I murdered Lanwin, and that you stabbed Agstone." "The deuce!" Haken started at this last remark. "They accuse me of that, do they? I didn't know that they would go so far. Well," he looked very straightly at his nephew and with very bright eyes, "you have no doubt heard what these people have had to say. And no doubt they have manufactured good fiction out of certain facts. My character, I take it, is as black as a crow." "Blacker, if anything." "No doubt. Well, and what do you say?" "I say that Jadby and Madame Marie, and possibly Horace, are liars." Haken walked round the table and placed his hand on his nephew's shoulder. "Do you believe that I am guilty?" "Certainly not." "Why? On what grounds?" Prelus laughed. He had always doubted the guilt of his uncle, ever since the telling of it in Rutland Square. Now he was sure that, however cleverly the story had been put together, Simon Haken would be quite capable of reconstructing it so as to prove his innocence. He therefore answered with a laugh, "On the grounds that you are much too clever a man to commit a murder without making things much safer than they appear to be in this instance." "Thank you," said Haken simply, and after a friendly squeeze of Prelus's shoulder, he returned to his seat. A weaker man would have required a more emotional denial, but Haken was too strong and too businesslike to trouble about sentiment. "You see," he remarked when again in his chair, "it would not have suited me to murder Lanwin." "No," assented Prelus, tickled by the remark. "Murder in this country is attended with certain disadvantages." Haken chuckled, and drank a second glass of port. In spite of his nonchalance, he was more nervous than he chose to admit. "Now tell me how our friends bring home the crime to me, and why they told you about the business." "I shall tell you the whole case from the beginning," said Prelus after a pause. "My connection with it began when Aunt Sophia came to bully me into doing something." Haken nodded sympathetically. "When your aunt interferes there is generally trouble. Well?" Prelus settled himself to work, and recounted the whole story, ending with his parting from Madame Marie on the stairs of Horace's house and the oath upon the crucifix. Haken smoked quietly while the narrative proceeded, merely raising his eyebrows when he heard how ingeniously the fortune teller and Jadby proved his guilt. When Prelus concluded, Haken chuckled and passed the port. "Have another glass, my boy," he said quietly. "You must be dry over that talking." All the same, Prelus noted that the perspiration was beading the old man's brow, and that he was exercising considerable will power to keep himself in hand. While Prelus sipped his fresh glass of wine, Haken walked up and down the length of the dining room, keeping silent. After quite 5 minutes he began to talk, still walking steadily. "I should have come to you for that money," he said in a conversational tone, "only that I don't like taking advantage of my wife's relatives. I needed £50,000 badly, and when Lanwin refused to lend the money, I scarcely knew what to do. However, the cash turned up unexpectedly, although I had to make a sacrifice to get it. I calculate that I shall have to pay cent per cent for that money. However, it is worth it. The worst is over, and everything is going swimmingly. I shall have no further trouble. So don't look glum, Prelus." "Oh, I'm not afraid of your finances," said the young man quickly, "as I know your head for figures, and know also that the soundest men in the city have their money troubles on occasions. But I am thinking of your being in the power of these wretches. That is," added Prelus, correcting himself, "in the power of Jadby. I don't think that Madame Marie is so bad, and Horace is gruff, but honest." Oh, Horace is all right, but Marie is as bad as they make them. Nonsense! She wants to help me. Selfishly, in order to secure Jadby, she must make use of you, otherwise you could go hang. But I must tell you that portions of her story and Jadby's story and that of Horace are correct. I got the herb in the way you heard, and I did go down to Hyde to see Lanwin. Were you in the library when Madame Marie went to bed? I was, admitted Hakin coolly. But by that time Lanwin had not commenced his hanky-panky with the herb. I asked him straight out to lend the money. He refused with a word or two of abuse, so I walked away and back to Folkestone, where I was stopping. There was no row, as I disdained to reply to Horace's coarse language. Madame Marie left the library at 5 minutes after 9. By 15 minutes past I left also, and by the window, on my way to Folkestone. What happened after I left I cannot say. What was Lanwin doing when you left? Fiddling with his herbs. He came and shut the window after I had gone, and shouted out a word or two as I departed. Do you suspect anyone of the crime? Hakin shrugged his shoulders. Unless it was Jadby. No, he replied thoughtfully. Jadby was in London and did not return until later. You heard his evidence in court. Then Agstone must be guilty. Agstone certainly hated his master, said Hakin. Why? Preless looked astonished. I understood that Agstone was devoted to Sir Oliver. So Lanwin said, and everyone believed. But the fact is, as I learned from Madame Marie, that Agstone was Lanwin's slave. Sir Oliver knew something about him which he used as a threat, and so kept him in bondage. Lanwin was not a pleasant character, ended the city man, twirling his cigar. Oh, Preless sunk his chin in his breast, and thought. He knew well enough that so far as the evidence of the knife was concerned, Agstone could not possibly be guilty. Nevertheless, since Agstone had brought the missing will to his brother, and the assassin could only have procured that will, it would seem that the old sailor, after all, had struck the blow. But why had he tried to put the blame on Mona, both by placing the knife in her hand and by accusing her? Did Madame Marie say that Agstone hated Mona? Asked Preless, raising his head. No, on the contrary. I understand that Agstone liked Miss Trent because she was kind to him. Sir Oliver, however, was of a jealous disposition, and Agstone was afraid to display his liking. Do you suppose that Madame Marie herself killed Lanwin? Certainly not. She had nothing to gain by doing so, and moreover lost a valuable client by Lanwin's death. Marie is fond of money too. She wants to make all she can, so as to marry Jadby. She is strangely infatuated with that rascal. Jadby is good-looking in a way, replied Preless. It seems to me that we are as far as ever from learning the truth. No doubt, assented his uncle. Still, one thing is certain, that I did not kill Lanwin. As to Agstone, he hesitated. You are not going to confess that you killed him, said Preless, with a wry smile. Hakin chuckled. No, I never tell unnecessary lies, but I certainly saw him dead, and Shepworth insensible. Oh, Preless was quite unmoved. So you did make use of that key? No, said Hakin again, and unexpectedly. There was no need to. I went down, intending to remonstrate with Shepworth on behalf of Rover, and found that the door was unfastened. I entered and saw what you saw, so at once I came upstairs, reclosing the door as I had found it. Why didn't you give the alarm? What, with Jadby hanging about, already intending to blackmail me for Lanwin's death? I should have given myself into the hands of the Philistines with a vengeance had I raised the alarm." "I see. So Jadby was the continental swell whom you told me that you were to meet?" "Yes. He insisted upon seeing me at the ball. Why he chose such a place I don't know, and how he got to the ball I can't imagine." "Oh, that was easy. Remember the mask? Jadby had only to assume a mask and domino, and could slip in easily. But this dress—" "I didn't wear it," interrupted Hakin quickly. "Woman's disguise is the last thing I should think of assuming with my figure and face, to say nothing of my age. It's my opinion—" He paused. "Well?" questioned Preless impatiently. "That Madame Marie wore the dress herself." "But how could she come to the ball? Constance never invited her." "You answered that question yourself a few minutes ago with a reference to Jadby. Madame Marie could easily have slipped on a mask and domino and have come to the ball to meet Jadby. Probably she wore that dress to implicate Constance and concealed it in Rover's dressing room to bring him into the matter. Remember, Madame Marie herself told you where the sham dress was to be found." "Yes," assented Lord Preless thoughtfully. "But how did Madame Marie learn what kind of costume Constance would wear?" "Rover told her. Yes, he came to me about Constance's love for Shepworth and told me that in his efforts to gain his wife's love he had gone to see if Madame Marie could give him a philter of sorts. Infernally silly to act in that way nowadays. Madame Marie told him to learn the exact costume which Constance would wear at the ball. You see, Constance was keeping her style of dress a secret from her husband, so that Rover could watch if she went down to see Shepworth. Rover learned about the dress from Constance's dressmaker and told me, and also told Madame Marie. It was easy then for Madame Marie to get the frock imitated and slip down to Shepworth's flat. By doing that she managed to kill Agstone, to implicate young Shepworth, and to throw the blame on Constance. A confoundedly clever woman is Marie Eppingrave," ended Hakin, chuckling. Lord Preless rose thoughtfully. "The further we go into this case the more complicated does it become," he remarked. "Certainly Agstone, knowing Madame Marie, would bring her into the room, while not knowing Constance he would not. Then again, Madame Marie knew about the herb and Constance did not. It would seem—" He stopped and walked abruptly to the door. "I must sleep on this," he said wearily. "But you know that I am innocent now that I have explained," said the old man, following and speaking anxiously. He liked Preless and did not wish him to have a bad opinion of his uncle by marriage. Preless grasped Hakin's hand. "I believed in your innocence before you gave the explanation," he replied. "Wish my aunt good night for me, Uncle Simon. I'm going home to think over things." "Your aunt will be annoyed." "Not so much as I will be, if I listen to her scolding. Good night." Hakin grumbled a trifle at being left to explain to Lady Sophia, but on going to the drawing room he found that his wife had gone to a concert in Park Lane. Thus he was saved the trouble of making things smooth and went to bed very thankfully. Hakin was not a young man, and the interview with Preless had shaken him greatly. Meanwhile Preless himself had driven straight to his rooms and had gone immediately to bed, thinking that he could better argue out the case as it stood when lying down than when sitting or standing. But he was so weary with talk and with the strain of the last few days that he fell sound asleep before he could arrive at any conclusion regarding the guilt or innocence of Madame Marie. It seemed to him that he had only been resting for 5 minutes when his valet woke him in the morning at 9 o'clock. Woke him also in a most unpleasant manner by presenting a telegram. Preless, half awake, tore open the orange-hued envelope. But he was wide awake when he finished reading the news it contained. The wire proved to be from Mrs. Blexley. "Miss Mona has disappeared." That was all the wire said, but it was quite enough. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Helpless. At Lanwin Grange all was confusion. About 12 o'clock on the previous day, Mona had left the house with the intention of going to Folkestone to interview Lady Sophia. She was unaware that this formidable personage had returned to London, and wished to explain how much she loved Lord Prelus, so that Lady Sophia might offer no opposition to the marriage. From the time that she had left the Grange she had not been seen. Mrs. Blexley was not alarmed until her young mistress failed to return to dinner, as she had promised. Then the housekeeper had sent a groom with a dog-cart over to the Folkestone Hotel, at which Lady Sophia was supposed to be stopping. The man had returned with the information that Miss Chint had not been seen at the hotel, and that Lady Sophia Hakin had gone back to London. It was then that Mrs. Blexley grew terrified. "Whatever will his lordship and Mr. Shepworth say?" she wailed. "They will be fit to take the skin off me." The butler advised an immediate wire to both the young gentlemen, but Mrs. Blexley, hoping to save the situation, refused to listen, alleging that perhaps Miss Mona, walking across the downs towards Folkestone, had lost herself. But when the night passed and still the girl did not put in an appearance, the housekeeper was compelled to send telegrams to Prelus and the barrister. The two friends, oddly enough, met at Charing Cross Station to go down by the same train. Naturally, they secured a first-class carriage in order to talk over the disappearance of Miss Chint. "What do you think about it?" asked Shepworth anxiously. "It is a new move on the part of that blackguard Jadby," replied the other between his teeth. "But would he dare?" "He would dare anything to gain his ends. He tried to shoot you, and now he has kidnapped Mona." "Are you sure of that, Dory?" "What other explanation can there be, Ned? Mona has not returned, and she never went near the Piccadilly Hotel in Folkestone, where my aunt has been staying. I expect after our meeting at Horace's this scoundrel came down and watched for an opportunity to get Mona by herself. Then he kidnapped her." "But he could not do that alone, and in England." "No doubt he had help of some sort, and the Downs are lonely. Besides, he threatened at Horace's to do me an injury, and what greater one could he inflict than to carry off Mona? Also, Madame Marie hinted that Jadby would strike at me through the girl I love. By the way, I have sent a special messenger to bring that lady down to Hyde." "For what reason, Dory?" "Madame Marie," said Prelus quietly, "may be a bad woman. Uncle Simon says that she is. All the same, she loves that Jadby beast, and will move heaven and earth to secure him. If he has carried off Mona, as I suspect, Madame Marie will help me." "How can she?" "She can go into a trance and see where Mona is hidden." Shepworth raised his eyebrows. "Dory, do you really believe in these magical things?" "There is no magic about them," retorted Lord Prelus bluntly, "save to people who can't see farther than their noses. Everything works under well-defined laws both in the seen and in the unseen worlds. It only needs a person to learn and understand these laws to work what the unthinking call miracles." "And you believe that this woman—" "Yes, I do," interrupted Prelus impatiently. "You have only to look into Madame Marie's eyes to see that she has the sight. She may be a bad lot, as Uncle Simon says, but there are black magicians as well as white ones. But there," he ended abruptly, "I am only talking in High Dutch to you." "I confess that I am not superstitious," said Shepworth thoughtfully. "Occult powers have nothing to do with superstition," said Preless in a calm and decisive way. "Everything is law, as I tell you, and when the law is known, certain things can be done. By means of the sacred herb, the spirit, that is the astral body, can part from the flesh and go where it will. When Madame Marie arrives at the Grange, I shall make her help me in that way. She will be quite willing, if only to thwart Jadby. But there." Preless again brushed away his words with a gesture. "I have explained enough to a skeptic such as you are. Let us talk of other matters. What do you intend to do about Constance?" Shepworth colored and looked out of the window at the landscape, which was flying past dream fashion. "I do not like to discuss Mrs. Rover even to you, Preless," he said stiffly. "Ned," answered his friend, "don't be a fool. If you had confided in me when we first met at Jetty's restaurant, a great deal of trouble might have been avoided. Besides, you told Mona, why should you not tell me?" And Preless waited for a reply. "I only told Mona that I loved Constance," said Shepworth, after an uneasy pause. "Naturally, I didn't like to say too much." "I quite understand. But the fact remains that you love Constance and that Constance loves you. She is a married woman." "Unfortunately for me," said Shepworth bitterly. "And unfortunately for her also, seeing that she is tied to a man who hates her more than he loves her. Rover's pride is wounded, Ned, by his wife's preference for you, and he'll make trouble." "I see that, and I wish to avoid trouble for Constance's sake. But what can I do?" "You can move from Alexander Mansions for one thing, and take a trip to the colonies for another. Rover may die." "There is no chance." "Pooh!" said Preless contemptuously. "The man's a bloodless little rat. And look at those dilated eyes of his. Like those of a fierce rabbit, if there is such a thing in nature. I shouldn't be at all surprised if Rover pegged out unexpectedly. He doesn't motor, nor golf, nor bicycle, nor shoot. In fact, he avoids all excitements. So Aunt Sophia told me. That shows how weak his heart is. Depend upon it." "No, no," said Shepworth impatiently. "Even for Constance, I do not want to build my future happiness on a man's death. I shall take your advice and go to Australia for a few years. It will be better for me and for Constance, since here we can only look at one another and dare not meet, much less speak, save in the presence of others. But there has been no scandal since Rover's marriage, and so far as I'm concerned there shall be no scandal. There, we have talked enough." "Poor old chap," said Preless, leaning forward to shake Shepworth's hand. "You're having a deuce of a time. Your karma, oh, hang your theosophy. Very good. One wastes words in speaking to the deaf. Besides, the matter of Mona's rescue is more important than anything else. Hang it, how slow this beastly train is." This was hard on the engine driver, who was doing his best, and actually was sending along the train at top speed. But had Preless been mounted on a flying bombshell, he would have found its speed too slow, since his thoughts, outstripping all other means of locomotion, had flown long since to the house in the hollow. However, the longest rivers get to the sea in the end, and the young men found themselves on Hyde platform. A motor car, ordered in advance by wire, waited them, and they were soon buzzing upward to Lanwin Grange. On arriving at the great mansion, they were met by Mrs. Blexley, all tears and lamentation. But Preless, in his stiff military manner, soon reduced her to common sense talk, and learned that although every inquiry had been made and every possible place searched, As yet Mona had not been found. She had disappeared as completely as a dewdrop does in the ocean. Even the local police could do nothing. "Which is just like the local police," growled Preless. "I say, Ned, you take the car and scout over the downs. Somewhere about there Jadby may hold her prisoner." "Oh, sir," wailed Mrs. Blexley, "do you think that such a nasty man has run away with Miss Mona?" "It is the sole solution of her disappearance that I can think of, Mrs. Blexley. There, don't talk any more. Ned, you go round the downs and use the car for speed. I'll wait until the arrival of Madame Marie and then search Folkestone." Preless looked sharply at Ned. "Do you know if Jadby has a boat or a yacht or a steamer of any sort?" "Yes," said Shepworth, starting to his feet. "Now you mention it, I did hear him say to Sir Oliver that he had a small steamer anchored in the Thames. But I can't give particulars." "Never mind. I'll set the police to work on this possible clue. If that steamer has been brought round to Folkestone Harbor, you may be sure that Mona is held prisoner on board. But if this is so, and Jadby has gone off to the South Seas, which is just what he would do, I'll borrow Uncle Simon's yacht. Twin screw, triple expansion, and a devil to go. I'll follow Jadby to Polynesia, and to hell if necessary," ended Lord Preless grimly. Arrangements being thus made, Shepworth went off in the car with a policeman who knew the neighborhood, and with the chauffeur who was a magnificent driver, and driving of the best was needed on the rolling uplands of the downs. Preless, left behind, waited for Madame Marie, and in the meantime asked Mrs. Blexley about the herb which Horace had given to the girl. "Was it in a small white parcel?" asked the housekeeper. "Yes, it contained some roots and leaves." "Miss Mona took it with her," explained Mrs. Blexley. "She asked me to make a linen bag and then sewed it inside her dress." "Good," said Preless, adding to himself, "if she has the herb and can make use of it, she may render Jadby insensible and escape." The reflection that Mona had this means of protection quieted him somewhat, but his anxiety rose again to fever heat when Madame Marie appeared. On this woman and on her occult powers depended the chance of saving Mona. But had Preless told this to the police he would have been jeered at. However, he had his own methods of going about things, and it was not needful for him to expose himself to ridicule. He watched anxiously for the fortune teller, and was amazed when she arrived in the unexpected company of Mr. Dolly Rover. "What the devil are you doing here?" asked Preless rudely. "I shall tell you," said the little man very deliberately, and looking at the other with his dilated blue eyes. "This morning I went to see Madame Marie about my wife. She loves Shepworth, and I want Shepworth removed out of her path and mine." "Do you propose murder to Madame?" asked Preless coolly. "No," replied Rover with a shudder, while the fortune teller sat down. "But I wished Captain Jadby to marry Miss Trent." "The deuce you did!" "To Shepworth, that is. I fancied that Jadby could manage the business, and I offered, through Madame Marie here, a sum of money if the marriage could be brought about." "Oh, indeed. And did Madame Marie tell you—" "I told him nothing," interrupted the woman in her deep voice. "I never intended to, without your permission, as I said that I was your friend. Your wire came while Mr. Rover and myself were talking. That is, your messenger came, so I brought Mr. Rover down with me." "And I came to help find Miss Trent," said Rover hurriedly. "I want her to be found and married to Shepworth. Any money I can offer to help in the search—" "I have ample money to deal with the matter," said Preless, pleased to find that the fortune teller had respected his confidence about the new engagement. But I don't see why you need have applied to Jadby to bring about this marriage." "Because I know that Jadby loves Miss Chint and wants to marry her, Lord Preless. As you know, that would not remove Shepworth beyond my wife's reach. I wish to bribe Jadby into letting Shepworth marry Miss Chint, as was arranged. Then my wife—" All right," cried Lord Preless irritably. "Don't worry your head, Rover. I'll see to this. And you had better clear off, back to London. Jadby is a rough customer, and if we get involved in a row, it will be bad for your heart." "My dear Lord Preless." "Yes, anyone can see. Oh, pooh, don't worry me." "My heart is weak," said Rover with dignity, "and my wife's behavior is not likely to make it strong. Nevertheless, I shall wait and help in the search for Miss Chint, and bribe Jadby as I said. He must not marry this young lady." "He won't," Madame assured him coolly. "He shall marry me." Preless turned to the fortune teller. "Will you go into a trance and see where Mona is?" "I have already been in a trance before leaving Bond Street." "Then you know—" Madame looked at him unflinchingly. "I could see nothing but clouds and clouds and clouds," she responded. "Only one thing I am certain of, and that is that Miss Chint is hidden somewhere amongst these downs." Preless shrugged his shoulders. "Much good that information does. I quite believe it, but where?" "I can't say, but," added Madame Marie with animation, "I can tell you that the steamer which Felix owns is coming round to Folkestone Harbor this afternoon. Felix asked me 2 days ago to tell his captain to take the boat round. I didn't know why he wished that. I can understand now." "So can I," rejoined Lord Preless quickly. "Jadby intends to take Miss Chint to the steamer at nightfall and do a bunk." "Yes," replied the fortune teller, breathing hard, "leaving me in the lurch. But he shan't. I'll kill him first." The young man looked at her curiously and wished to ask her if she had killed Agstone. But he did not think that it was wise to irritate her at so critical a moment, so merely asked, "What is the name of the steamer?" "The Canaro. That is the name of one of the Easter Island statues which are worshipped by the natives." "Jadby seems to be very closely connected with Easter Island. He certainly has made good use of the sacred herb." "What do you mean?" asked Madame Marie angrily. "Nothing," replied Preless, wondering why she should grow so angry. "But I think we have talked enough. Mr. Shepworth is exploring the downs in a motor car, so you and Mr. Rover here can go also if you like." "Yes, yes," said the fortune teller eagerly and with very bright eyes. "We can do that, but I would rather go alone." "No," said Dolly, piping out his decision. "I wish to aid in finding Miss Chint. I must get her married to Shepworth." "Very good," said Preless with a short laugh. "Go and hunt. I shall go to Folkestone and see after the Canaro. Describe her, madam." The woman did so at once, and Preless left the house an hour later with a full knowledge of what kind of boat Jadby owned. Walking to Hyde, he took the train to Sandgate, and then used the funicular to reach the Leas. Here he swept the horizon and the harbor with his marine glass to seek for the steamer in which Jadby intended to fly with Mona Chint. But he could see no sign of the boat. Had Preless been absolutely wise, he would have gone to the police station to engage a couple of constables to board the vessel. But he preferred to trust in his own strong arm and in his own wits, which had hitherto served him excellently. Also, unless the constables had a warrant, they could not board the yacht if refused permission. It was better, thought the young man, to go alone and interview the captain. If Jadby was not open to argument, the captain might be. and an intimation that the law would be put in force if Miss Chint was kidnapped might prevent the commander of the Canaro from risking his own liberty and the liberty of his crew. So Preless went down to the harbor and watched for the coming of the steamer. To his surprise he found that she had arrived an hour since, and was anchored some distance away from the land. There was no doubt that this was the Canaro, as not only did she correspond to the description given by the fortune-teller, but by means of the glass he saw the name on her stern. Lord Preless acted promptly and engaged a boat to be rowed on board the steamer. When he climbed up the rope ladder hanging over the side, he was greeted unceremoniously by a rough-looking man in a nondescript sort of uniform. In reply, Preless handed his card, upon which the officer's manner changed to one of courtesy. He conducted Lord Preless to a richly furnished cabin and removed his cap with an explanation. "I know your name, my lord," he said politely. "Madame Marie mentioned it to me. I am Captain Bryson, in command of this yacht." "It belongs to Captain Jadby?" Bryson shrugged his heavy shoulders. "So he says, my lord, but I think that it is the property of Madame Marie herself. Still, as Captain Jadby is to marry her, they can both own it." "Captain Jadby wants to marry a young lady whom he is kidnapping," was Preless's sharp reply. "And if you aid him to do so, the law—" "Stop, sir," said Bryson, rising. "My first mate said something of this today. I'll bring him in." And he tramped heavily out. Preless waited, but the man did not return. Then he tried the door of the cabin and found it locked. It flashed across him at once that he had been trapped. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The beginning of the end. After a strong word or two, Preless sat down philosophically to consider his position. A weaker man might have raged aimlessly and have wasted his strength in battering at the closed door, but Lord Preless was too wise to kick against the pricks. He had been trapped sure enough, and he did not see any way out of the trap. No one knew where he was save the boatman who had brought him, and even as this thought came into his mind he heard the raucous voice of Bryson telling the man that his passenger would remain on board. More than this, Bryson paid the waterman and sent him away. Until the hue and cry was raised, the owner of the boat would say nothing, so it was absolutely certain that Preless would have to remain in durance vile without hope of immediate rescue. The situation, however, was not devoid of certain consolations. Without doubt, Jadby's plan was to bring Mona on board the Canaro and steam away with her to Polynesia. Preless, at all events, would be on the same boat as the girl, and if it came to fighting with Jadby, he felt certain that he could hold his own. Moreover, if, as Bryson declared, the yacht belonged to Madame Marie, he, as her captain, owed fealty to her rather than to Jadby. And the fortune-teller certainly would not allow her steamer to carry Mona Chint to the South Seas to be the bride of her precious Felix. No! Things, on reflection, were not so bad after all. In any case, Preless felt that he was in the thick of the whole villainous business, and soon would be within arm's length of Mona. When she was dragged on board by her scoundrelly kidnapper, it would then be the time to act. Preless lovingly fingered a revolver which he had strapped behind him, and wondered if it would be necessary to use it. The weapon formed a strange addition to the very civilized suit of tweeds which he wore, and was out of place in sober, law-abiding England. But then danger and murder and sudden death had entered into his life, and it was necessary to prepare for emergencies. "I am not a bloodthirsty man," said Prelus, while seeing that his gun was well loaded and worked without a hitch. "But I should like one clean shot at Felix Jadby." And it may be mentioned that if the shooting took place, Prelus would probably hit the bull's eyes, represented by the buccaneer. He was a clean shot and very quick with his weapon, as those who inhabited uncivilized parts knew from experience. The afternoon wore on to 6 o'clock, and still Prelus was left alone in his floating dungeon. Probably Bryson did not desire a personal explanation, knowing that he could not make any very pertinent reply to this breaking of the law. And it was possible that he preferred to leave the explanation to Jadby when he arrived with his prey. Personally, Prelus cared very little. He knew that Mona was safe, though in the power of a scoundrel, for she was a brave girl, and a religious girl who firmly believed in God. So did Prelus, and he was quite content to think that God, who was slightly stronger than Felix Jadby, would look after his angel. This being so, and the young man knowing that God would bring everything to pass for the best in his own good time, Prelus quietly smoked cigarette after cigarette throughout that weary afternoon. Then he stretched himself on the divan and went to sleep, wondering how Ned was getting on with his search and what Madame Marie and Rover were doing. He was awakened about 8 o'clock by a bright light and a sense that someone was looking steadily at him. With a yawn, he opened his eyes and saw that a steward was lighting the swing lamp over the central table, and that Captain Bryson was looking down upon him. The sailor had a rugged but somewhat good-natured face, and possessed an extraordinary athletic figure, which promised well for fighting purposes. "Well," said Prelus, swinging his legs onto the floor, "are you going to starve me?" Bryson burst into a hoarse laugh, while his unwilling guest blinked and rubbed his eyes. "You're a plucky chap, my lord," said he approvingly. "Thanks awfully, but I prefer food to compliments. I'm just about to eat myself. Hurry up, Stewart." Then, when the man had gone out, Bryson threw his cap on a chair and resumed. "You wonder maybe why I keep you here?" "No," said Prelus, stretching himself. "It's all in the game." "What game?" asked Bryson abruptly. "The very dangerous one you are playing along with Jadby and your mistress. With Dr. Horace, too, for all I know." "I've never met Horace, whoever he may be," retorted Bryson gruffly. "But all I know of the game is that I have to obey orders. If you break owners," finished Prelus, remembering the saying, "and you will break them before you're done." "None of your larks, my lord. I've got a gun." "So have I," answered Prelus, "loaded in all 6 chambers. But you need make no mistake, Bryson. I intend to stop here and see the game out to the end. Captain Jadby and I have to settle accounts." "What sort of accounts?" "Well, Jadby is kidnapping the lady to whom I am engaged. You can't expect me to stand that." "I guess not," assented Bryson agreeably. "I'm hitched up with a girl of spirit myself, and if anyone dare to—" He clenched his huge fist, looking pistols and daggers and maximum guns. "That's the proper spirit, Bryson. By the way," Prelus got out a cigarette, "you might tell me how much you know of this business." "Very little, I reckon," answered the captain, more and more puzzled by the young man's coolness. "Jadby and Madame came to London some months ago, and she started the fortune-telling racket while he went to see his uncle. I anchored the boat in Thames River and went a loaf round the coast at times to keep the barkey in trim. Then the other day, Madame sends a message that I'm to bring the Canaro round here, which I have done. Now I'm waiting for further orders." "When Jadby comes on board with Miss Chint?" Bryson nodded. But I don't take any orders from any son of a sea cook, you can bet your boots. Madam's owner, and she wants to run in double harness with Jadby, rum though her taste may be. If he's skipping with a girl, that's Madam's lookout. I don't sail until she gives me the office." Preless nodded his approval. "In that case, Jadby will get left," he remarked coolly, "for he's trying to play low down on Madame Marie. By the way, if you know so little of the game, why detain me?" "Well," said Bryson, scratching his head, "Madame visited the yacht at times when we were swinging off Gravesend. She told me there was some trouble over these murders." "You know about them?" "Only what I read in the papers. But Madame said that you were taking a hand in the meddling way, and that she'd like to keep you out of the whole business. As I like Madame, who is a dandy fine woman with a temper, I put you in quod the moment I heard your name. You must stop here, my lord, until Madame comes on board." "You have acted in a somewhat high-handed manner, and without any instructions to go upon," said Preless calmly. "If I wanted to make a row, I could." "Not in this ship," growled Bryson. "Oh, I think so. Yonder is the porthole, and there isn't very much distance between this boat and the shore. Also, there are other steamers lying at anchor close at hand. Not to speak of my boatman having been in a position to be spoken to from the porthole. I could fire a shot or two and rouse the harbor, and I could have hailed my boatman before you sent him away. I did none of these things. And why? Because I am in the very position I wish to be in. Jadby is coming on board, and I want to meet Jadby." "And to rescue the girl." "To rescue the young lady," corrected Preless coldly. "If you attempt to clear out with Miss Trent, I'll make it hot for you." "What can you do?" "What I said. I have my revolver. See?" Preless whipped out his weapon before Bryson could move. "I have you covered. What is to prevent me from shooting you and racing on deck to swim ashore?" The captain did not move a muscle. "You can put the gun down, my lord," said he with a note of admiration in his voice. "I promise you that I won't steam for the Southern Cross until Madame gives the word." "Madame won't come on board." "Then I wait until she does," retorted Bryson. "Will you put that gun down, or am I to be shot?" "You are more used to me alive than dead," said Preless, and slipped his derringer behind him, handy for the grip. "But I see the tea is on the table. I'm infernally hungry." Bryson smacked his great thigh and looked at Preless with much admiration. "Guess you'll come home on the winter," said he as they sat at the table. "And I should just love to see you get the bulge on that son of a sea cook." "Meaning Jadby?" "Meaning Jadby," assented Bryson gravely. "Have some salt tack." The hungry guest assented very readily, and ate a decent meal of extremely bad seafood. Preless was not fastidious when in the wilds, and passed over the table like a prairie fire. At the conclusion of the meal, Bryson mixed him a tot of rum, and handed along a box of very good cigars, which had never paid duty. Then, to pass the time until Jadby arrived, they chatted. Amongst other things, Preless learned that Bryson had met Sir Oliver Lanwin, and did not like him. The baronet had a bad record in the South Seas. "I was in his service once," growled Bryson, cutting up tobacco with a clasp knife, "but he gave me the chuck, 'cause I wouldn't pile up a schooner which he'd insured for wrecking. Agstone did, though," and he filled a dirty little pipe with the rank tobacco. You knew Agstone?" Bryson nodded. "He was a fairy tale pirate, was Agstone," said he. "Lord, I could put in the night yarning about his doings. Murder amongst them, too," and he spat. "Sir Oliver knew of that, and got the hang of Aggie. No wonder Aggie got square with him." "Do you mean to say that he murdered Sir Oliver?" You can hold on to that, my lord. Sir Oliver treated Aggie like the old devil treats a holy man. Course, I wouldn't swear to Aggie's knifing him in a court of law, but it sounds like Aggie. Wonderfully quick with his sticker was Aggie. And who do you think murdered Agstone? Bryson leered. You've got me there, he confessed. I can't lay my hand on the son of a gun that did that. Prelist nodded. Possibly Agstone had turned on his tyrant to send him below, but it was impossible to say who had sent Agstone to join the baronet. About Madame Marie now, is that her real name? He inquired. Oh, yes, Marie Epingrave. She's the daughter of a Tahiti merchant and a French lady. There's no half-caste rubbish about Madame, you bet. She's got cash, too. This yacht and a slap-up island all to herself. Why she wants to collect Jadby into her life, I don't know. But there, you can't understand women folk. You like Madame Marie? Seeing she nursed me through a yellow fever bout and gave me this command, I do, said the man of the sea. A good sort is Madame, with a temper of sorts, of course, as every woman should have. She'd knife a man as soon as look at him and nurse him square after her temper had busted. Wish she'd knifed Jadby. He's a rotten beachcomber. Prelist thought for the space of half a cigar. And Madame Marie's fortune-telling? Well, I guess there's no explanation of that, my lord. She's got piles of cash, but maybe her heart's in them hocus-pocus things. I've seen her do some rum business on occasions. When she looks at you, you feel cold water freezing your spine. Can't say I'd like to have her to be Mrs. Bryson, even if I put my old gal into her wooden overcoat. But Madame Marie's a dandy fine woman. No mistake about that. In such life conversation did the two while away the time until 10 o'clock. Then they went on deck. Bryson was quite willing to allow Prelist to accompany him, as he had grown to like the young man, and moreover was ready to take his word that he would not try to escape. But Prelist warned him that he would make trouble to save Mona if needful, and Bryson, being on the side of Madame Marie, was agreeable that it should be so. Besides, he had a sneaking liking for Prelist's somewhat stormy wooing, and wished to help him. Perhaps a strong dislike for Jadby had something to do with Bryson's attitude. It was a perfect night, lighted by a brilliant moon and countless stars. A warm wind was blowing from the land, and far up on the heights twinkled the innumerable lights of Folkestone. The Canaro rocked at anchor a stone's throw from the shore, and many other vessels of a less piratical nature were anchored in the harbor. The water shone like a sheet of silver, and the green and red riding lights of the ships glittered in the sheeny depths. Prelist leaned over the side of the boat and strained his eyes to see if any craft was approaching the Canaro. But for quite half an hour he beheld nothing. However, he was tolerably certain that Jadby would come carrying Mona with him, and felt if his revolver was ready in his hip pocket. If need be, he was resolved to shoot the buccaneer, and who can blame him, considering how basely Jadby had acted? It was when the clock from the church tower boomed out 11 that the trouble came. Bryson laid his big hand on Prelist's arm and pointed to a boat which was putting off from a somewhat deserted part of the shore. 3 figures were in it, 2 rowing and 1 seated, holding the tiller ropes. The rowers were laboring hard to reach the Canaro, and Prelist saw through his glass that other figures on the land were launching another boat to follow. "There's going to be a holy show," swore Bryson under his breath. "I wish—" He fingered his revolver, but did not dare to use it. The place was too civilized. The first boat came on swiftly, and Prelist discerned that Jadby was rowing with the other man, and that Madame Marie was seated in the stern. He could see nothing of Mona, and his heart thrilled as he thought from the presence of the second boat which had now put off, that the girl had been saved and that her kidnapper was now being pursued. Bryson watched the race between the two boats and then ran onto the bridge. Preless heard him shout to the engineer to start the engines, for the boat had steam up, and a minute later he heard the steady throbbing of the screw while a rush of men hastily pulled up the anchor. Apparently Bryson saw that the only chance of safety for Madame Marie and Jadby was to have the boat ready to start, and risk the engines going before the anchor was up. Indeed, this latter took so much time, and time was so precious, that he shouted out to let the anchor slip, and the roar of the chain showed that his orders had been obeyed. Meanwhile, many people were rushing to and fro on the shore. It was apparent that everyone knew something untoward was going on, and that there was intense excitement. Already other boats were putting off, and Bryson was cursing, like the old salt he was, at the danger of his beloved mistress. The first boat swung near the side of the yacht, and Bryson raced from the bridge to the side to shake out the rope ladder. Madame Marie rose to grip the rope, but in a moment Jadby was on his feet and, catching her round the waist, had thrown her into the sea. Bryson gave a cry of wrath, and as Jadby placed his hand on the ladder, he leaned over, fumbling behind with his hand. The next moment there was a clear, sharp crack of a revolver, and Jadby, with a wild cry, fell off the ladder into the sea. The boatman cowered in his craft, and Preless could see the head of Madame Marie appear some distance away as she came to the surface and drifted with the tide. On witnessing the sudden catastrophe, the second boat rowed towards the drowning woman. Bryson uttered a shout of rage as Madame Marie was pulled into the boat, and ran up again onto the bridge. "Damn it! They've got her!" he yelled, and twirled the dial to full speed ahead. Then he sprang to the wheel and wrenched it out of the steersman's hands. Preless soon saw what he meant. The Canaro bore straight down onto the boat. Bryson was evidently prepared to kill his mistress rather than let her fall into the hands of her enemies. A shout of dismay arose from the boat as the great bulk of the yacht swung forward. In a flash Preless took his choice, and poised his revolver at the mad captain. There was a crack of the revolver, a cry from Bryson, and he went down like a shot, while the boat swung helplessly in the harbor, the engines working powerfully, but the wheel swinging idly. 2 or 3 sailors, seeing that Preless had shot the skipper, came towards him with a rush. The young man did not lose time. He jumped on the taffrail and dived straight into the silver tide. As he rose to the surface, the crew flung belaying pins and spars and bits of coal lying on the deck at him. One man, with a straighter aim than the others, hit Preless with a lump of hard coal. The young man uttered a gasping cry, and flinging up his hands, went down. His last look was at the yacht, and he saw that she swung round and was heading full speed for the entrance to the harbor. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Explanations. When Lord Preless recovered his senses, he opened his eyes in a comfortable room on a comfortable bed, and saw, as in a dream, that Ned was seated beside him. His head felt confused and sore, but he regained sufficient command of his wits to recognize his friend. "Where am I, Ned?" he asked in a feeble voice, and put up a weak hand to his head, which was bandaged. "At Lanwin Grange," replied Shepworth quietly, thinking it best to explain reasonably, and glad to think that Preless was sane. The knock on his head had been a nasty one. "Who pulled me out of the water?" "One of the Bowots that followed us picked you up when you rose for the second time. You have had a narrow escape from death, Dory." "Mona?" asked Preless, closing his eyes. She is all right, but somewhat shaken after her experiences. With that blackguard Jadby, what of him? Dead, shot through the heart. His body was found and now lies at Folkestone, awaiting the inquest. And Bryson, the man who shot him? Oh, Bryson did that, did he? Said Shepworth. He's got a good eye and saved us a lot of trouble. Well, Bryson and the Canaro have gone into the wide world. I expect he's on the high seas, making for Polynesia, and won't be caught. I hope not, for after all, he only saved Jadby from the hangman. Why? What did Jadby do? He murdered Dolly Rover. Ned, do you mean to say... I mean to say nothing just now. Try and go to sleep. Here, drink this first. You are still weak. Hang it, Dora, you have been unconscious for 24 hours, and heaps has happened. One last question, and then I'll sleep, said Preless, who felt that he was weak from loss of blood. Madame Marie? Dead. She killed herself after confessing. Confessing what? Many things. Go to sleep, Dory, I tell you. Preless did not answer, but closed his eyes with a groan, feeling very stiff and sore and wonderfully weary. But sleep, the great healer, soothed his too restless brain and mended his broken body, so that he woke again after hours of slumber, feeling hungry and refreshed, and eager to learn all that had taken place. It was candlelight when he closed his eyes, but the sun was shining into the room when he opened them again, and beside his bed Ned had been replaced by Mona. She was hanging over him like a mother over her firstborn, and uttered a coo of satisfaction when he looked at her and smiled. Mona, darling, said the sick man, thrusting out one weak hand. She kissed it and tucked it again under the clothes. Go to sleep. Preless, feeling ever so much stronger, objected to being treated like an infant, sweet though it was when Mona was the nurse. I have had enough sleep, he said, yawning. One can overdo laziness, my dear girl. Besides, I am hungry. Ah! Mona laughed. You can't live on love? No, said Preless ruefully. I am too earthly. Now breakfast is waiting. Come, let me place this pillow behind you and soothe the clothes so and kiss me so, said the invalid, suiting the action to the word. The future Lady Preless tapped his cheek in pretended displeasure and went to the door. In another minute she returned, followed by Mrs. Blexley, bearing a tray, which she placed before the hungry young man. Coffee and cream, 2 lightly boiled eggs, thin bread and butter, and honey from our own bees, said Mrs. Blexley, arranging the tray. I hope that your lordship is better. My lordship is starving, Mrs. Blexley. And no wonder, sighed the housekeeper, placing one fat hand over her ample breast. You ain't had anything for hours and hours, my dear, if you'll excuse my boldness in calling you so. And to think of all the terrible things that had happened, while you were lying there as pretty and neat as though you were in your coffin and... Blexley, you're a ghoul. Go away, said Mona imperiously. I'm a united inhabitant of the celestial regions, said Mrs. Blexley with dignity, but I see that you want to feed him, my dear lady. May the dear Lord bless your marriage, and happy I am that I should have lived to see this day. She waited for a reply, but Mona was too busy assisting Preless with his breakfast to answer, and the young man was too busy admiring Mona to worry about the stout housekeeper. So she heaved a sigh and retired in a flood of tears, as she thought how happy they would be. It was an odd way of showing her joy, but Mrs. Blexley, after the manner of her class, wept indiscriminately for a wedding or for a funeral. Mona, dearest and best, said Preless when halfway through his second egg, I am a selfish beast. You are looking tired, and here I am letting you feed me. "I am not tired at all," denied the girl vigorously, "but my nerves are a trifle out of order after what I have undergone. Hush! Eat your breakfast, you tiresome boy. Will you give me a kiss if I drink another cup of coffee?" "No, I'll give you a cigarette. Then you can sleep and get up at midday. Mr. Shepworth and Mr. Martaban want to see you on business." "Why do you speak of Ned so stiffly, Mona?" "I am engaged to you now," she replied demurely. "That doesn't mean poor Ned is to be left out in the cold." "He won't. I expect that he'll marry Mrs. Rover after her months of mourning are over." "Ah, yes. Ned mentioned that Jadby had murdered Dolly. How did it happen, Mona, my dear?" The girl shuddered and took away the tray. "I don't think Captain Jadby meant to kill him," she said in a low voice. "Madame Marie denies that he did. But Mr. Rover's heart was weak, and so—" "Give me that cigarette and tell me all about it from the beginning, dear," said Prelus coaxingly. Mona did as she was asked, as he really now looked much better for the food and the night's rest. In fact, Prelus was in such good spirits that he apologized for his untidy appearance. "I must look a regular Bill Sikes with this rough chin," he said, passing his hand over his face. "Oh, how delicious this cigarette is. Well?" "I'll tell you all as quickly as I can," said Miss Chint, sitting beside him and allowing him to hold her hand, on the principle that sick people must be humored. "You know that Captain Jadby carried me off in a motor car." "Infernal insolence!" "Hush, George. The poor wretch is dead, so I forgive him everything." "All right. I'll try and be a Christian, such as you are, although it is not easy. Fire ahead." "I started to walk to Hyde to catch the train to Folkestone, in order to see Lady Sophia," explained Mona slowly. "I did not know that she had returned to London. Just as I got into the belt of woods between Hyde and the Downs, a motor car met me, coming up. Captain Jadby was driving it." "Didn't know he could drive," growled Prelus restlessly. "Oh, yes. Uncle Oliver talked of having a motor, and asked his son to learn driving, so that he might take him about with him. And in fact, I think that Uncle Oliver presented this motor to Captain Jadby when he learned how to handle the machine." "Didn't your uncle tell you that he did?" "No, and yes. That is, he let slip a word or two. But what does it matter? Captain Jadby had this motor, and a very good one it was. At least Ned says so." "Ned, and not Mr. Shepworth. That's right, darling." And Prelus patted her hand. "Go on, sweetness." "I can't if you keep interrupting me," said Mona severely. "Well, then, Captain Jadby got out and said that he was coming up to see me, and while he was speaking to me he lighted a cigarette." "Hang him! Confound him!" "But it wasn't a cigarette after all, as I found," went on Miss Chint hurriedly. "He had twisted up a leaf or two of the herb into the form of a cigarette, and when it was lighted he suddenly seized me and held it smoking under my nose. I screamed, but no one was near to hear me, and then I became rigid and helpless. Owing to the scantiness of the smoke, I did not become quite insensible, but fell into a cataleptic state, as Mr. Shepworth did." "And as you did in the library." "No, for then I became quite insensible. Of course, had not Captain Jadby tricked me by twisting the leaves into a sham cigarette, I should have run away. As it was, the smoke seized me before I could do anything. I became cataleptic, as I said, and could move neither hand nor foot, although I was quite conscious all the time. Captain Jadby put me into the car and arranged the rug round me. Then Mona hesitated and colored. He kissed me." "Damn him! Hang him! Curse him!" raged Prelus, banging on his pillow. "I wish he was alive that I could horsewhip him. The beast, the—" "Hush, hush!" Mona placed a cool hand over her lover's mouth. "He is dead now. Leave his punishment to God. But you can fancy my feelings when, owing to the herb, I had to suffer his kiss." She passed a handkerchief across her mouth. Then, while Prelus swore under his breath, she continued quickly, so as to prevent another outbreak of anger. "Captain Jadby drove the motor up the hill and over the downs. As I was conscious, though helpless, I carefully noted the way so that I might return if I escaped." "Did you see anyone on the road or on the downs?" "Not a soul," she replied. "We went far inland and then turned to one side. Captain Jadby drove the car off the road and across the grass for over a mile. It swayed and bumped, but he is a wonderful driver and managed to prevent the car from overturning. At last we came to a small hut in a hollow, quite concealed from the surrounding country. No one would have noted it, for the side and the chimney were built of turf and the roof was thatched with green rushes. It looked quite like a part of the hollow itself, and great gray stones were lying about on all sides. Captain Jadby drove the car into some bushes and carried me into the hut. He then sat me down and talked." "What did he say?" asked Prelus, frightfully pale and grinding his teeth. "I am bound to acknowledge," said Mona quietly, "that after the one kiss he behaved like a gentleman. He told me that he would keep me here until the next evening, when he intended to take me on board Madame Marie's yacht and steam for the South Seas. I heard all he said, but could not reply until the effects of the drug had worn off. Captain Jadby had evidently prepared the place for my prison. The door was strong, and the one window was barred. And then there was a girl to wait on me." "A girl?" Prelus stared in great surprise. "Yes, I was astonished and thankful to see one of my own sex. After Captain Jadby had explained that he intended to carry me off in the Canaro, he went out and brought in the girl. She was a native of the South Seas, very handsome and dark, called Vavi, but could speak very little English. Captain Jadby told me that the girl was Madame Marie's maid, and that he had brought her here to be my companion. Then he went away, and I never saw him again until 8 o'clock the next evening. At least," added Mona, correcting herself, "I fancy it was 8 o'clock. But it might have been 6 or 7. I lost all count of time. So that was how I was kidnapped." "It was cleverly done," said Prelus caustically. "Go on." "In about an hour I came out of the cataleptic state and tried to escape, but the girl showed me a knife and intimated in her broken English that she would stab me if I did. I tried to bribe her, but she would not be bribed. I had therefore to make the best of it, as I was alone amidst those lonely hills with a half-savage woman for a companion. All the same, George, I was not afraid. I knew that you would look for me and that God was watching over me." "Dear, I thought the same." Prelus kissed her hand. "Then I remembered the sacred herb which Dr. Horace had given me. I got it ready, and when Captain Jadby came the next evening with the car to take me on board the Canaro, which he told me was at Folkestone, I waited my opportunity. Vavi had been cooking. There was plenty of good food," said Mona in parenthesis, "and the fire had smoldered to red ashes. When Captain Jadby entered, he sent Vavi away. Where she went I do not know, but Captain Jadby sat by the fire and made me sit also. We had 2 stools. Then he talked a lot of rubbish about loving me and the necessity of getting away from Madame Marie. He said that she was an old fool who loved him, but that he intended to make use of her yacht and run away with me. He finally said that by the time Madame Marie found him again in the South Seas, I would be his wife. After that he called you names and—" "I can guess the stuff he spouted," said Preless contemptuously. "What about the herb? Did you make use of it?" "Yes. When Captain Jadby was not looking at me, but bending over the fire stirring it with his cane, I dropped all the leaves onto the ashes. A thick white smoke arose. I got up quickly and sprang on Captain Jadby's shoulders to hold his nose over the smoke. It caught him in a second, and he received the full volume in his face. I felt dizzy myself, but managed to pull him back out of the fire and ran to the door. It was not locked since Vavi went out, so I escaped into the open. It was growing dark, and I ran up the hill to get out of the hollow as quickly as I could." "And Vavi with her knife?" asked Preless excitedly. "I never saw her. I don't know where she went. I ran without a hat or cloak up the hills and over the downs. Then I saw the road, and struck out for that. It was very late when I reached the Grange, and I fainted in Mrs. Bletchley's arms." "No wonder," muttered Preless. "But thank God you tricked the beast, and with the sacred herb, too." Preless chuckled. "You paid him out in his own coin. But what happened next?" "I can't tell you myself. I can only repeat what Ned told me. He gathered a lot from Madame Marie when she confessed." "What did she say?" "Wait, and I'll tell you in an orderly manner, George. After I ran away, Vavi came back to the hut. She found that I was gone and Captain Jadby insensible with the smoke. Instead of hunting for me, very luckily, she set to work to revive him." "But could she, seeing that the herb—" "Vavi," said Mona quickly, "came from Easter Island and knew all about the herb. The priests there have a way of reviving those who go into such trances. How Vavi did it, I don't know, but she managed in an hour to bring Captain Jadby to his senses. As soon as he got them, he rushed out, still half dizzy, to search for me. Just as he left the hut, he came upon Madame Marie and Mr. Rover, who had been searching on the downs for me." Yes, I remember they started out." "Well?" "Captain Jadby thought in his dizziness and in the twilight that Mr. Rover was you and seized him by the throat, saying he would kill you rather than let you marry me. Madame Marie tried to pull him off, but Captain Jadby held on tight. Then Vavi helped, by Madame's command, and they released Mr. Rover. He was dead." Preless nodded. "I quite understand. The poor devil had a weak heart, and should not have mixed himself up in this business. I told him that Jadby was a rough customer. Strange how Jadby has been the means of removing an obstacle from Ned's path. Well, then, what happened?" "Madame gave Captain Jadby something to revive him entirely. Some drug, some antidote. He became quite himself, and was terrified when he saw what he had done. Madame insisted that he should fly with her from England, lest he should be hanged for the murder of Mr. Rover, and made him get the car. It was ready to take me to the Canaro, if you remember, but instead it took Madame Marie and Vavi and Captain Jadby. When they reached the road, they met the car with Mr. Shepworth, who had been searching for me, and were recognized." "Perhaps Ned took Vavi for you." "Perhaps he did in the twilight," assented Mona. "At all events, Ned's chauffeur followed, and then there was a race to Folkestone Harbor. Captain Jadby's car was the best, and he gained about 10 minutes. In the harbor he and Madame seized a boat, and leaving Vavi on the shore, they offered the boatman £20 to row them to the Canaro. He did, and then— well, you know." "Yes," said Preless slowly and with a sigh. "Jadby tried to kill that poor woman, who loved him too well, and Bryson shot him. I shot Bryson when he tried to run down the boat in which Ned was following, and into which he had pulled Madame Marie. I wish I had killed Bryson, but unfortunately I only winged him," ended Preless regretfully. "I dare say he's all right now and sailing for the Southern Cross." "Oh, my dear, dear angel!" he cried, gathering Mona into his arms. "What an escape!" "Let us thank God, darling," she said reverently, and they both did with full hearts. It was a very excellent beginning to a new life. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A confession. That afternoon Preless was up and dressed and seated in the drawing room, talking earnestly to Martaban and Ned Shepworth. His head was perfectly clear, although still a trifle sore, and he wore a picturesque bandage round it, which added to his pale and interesting looks. But the color was gradually creeping back to his cheeks, and he was well enough to hear further what had taken place since he had been rendered unconscious. Shepworth was lounging in the window seat under one of the painted windows, and it might have been the rosy light which came through this which made him look so happy and healthy. On the other hand, it might have been the consciousness that fate had opened the way to his marrying the woman he loved and who loved him. He could not find it in his heart to regret Rover's timely death. The man had always behaved badly to his wife, and had done his best to make her life a martyrdom. Now, poor victim of a family sacrifice, she would have a chance of being happy for the rest of her life. Mr. Martaban, seated at the table with a few sheets of foolscap before him, also looked happy. And no wonder! His beloved client, Miss Mona Chint, had inherited the lovely old house and 10,000 a year, and shortly was to become Lady Preless. A great change this from the time, not so long ago, when she had stood in the New Bailey dock accused of murder. And again, the sheets of foolscap with which the lawyer fiddled contained a confession by Madame Marie Epengrave, which entirely cleansed the name of Miss Chint from the stain of crime. "This is not the original document," explained the delighted Mr. Martaban to the anxious Lord Preless. "Inspector Burge has the original, which was signed by Marie Epengrave in his presence." "How did she come to make the confession?" "I think it was because Captain Jadby was dead," put in Shepworth from his end of the room. "She held up until it was proved beyond all doubt that he had been shot through the heart. Then, I suppose, she saw that life was not worth living without him, and so decided to put an end to herself." "How did she manage it, seeing that she was in custody?" "Oh, she had some phial filled with poison about her. I expect she had everything prepared to make away with herself should Jadby have succeeded in kidnapping Mona to the South Seas. However, we stopped that, thank heaven, and Madame Marie confessed." "I wonder she did," said Preless reflectively. "I think it was because she had a sneaking regard for you, Dory," said the barrister after a pause. "To the last she declared that she was your friend and hoped that you would be happy. However, she did confess, and yonder is the copy of her confession." "What does it say?" questioned the other man. "I am about to read it to you," said Martaban, gathering up the sheets skillfully. "Or else, if you prefer it, I can give you a shorter account in the form of a story." "I should prefer that," said Preless gravely. "I haven't patience to wait to the end of that long creed to know the exact truth. Who murdered Sir Oliver? Tell me at once." "Steve Agstone, inspired and coerced by Madame Marie." So Bryson was right after all," commented Preless. "And who got rid of Agstone?" "Captain Jadby." "The deuce!" Prelis raised himself on his couch. "Did he wear that sham frock?" "He did," said Shepworth quickly, "and being, as you know, slimly built, I quite mistook him for a woman, seeing how clever was the disguise." Martaban waved his hand impatiently as Shepworth drew breath to continue his speech. "Let me speak," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Lord Prelis, you know of course that Madame Marie Eppengrave was deeply in love with this man Jadby." "Yes, Bryson told me so, and so did Madame herself." "To make a long story short," said Martaban, gathering up the papers and speaking with much deliberation, "this woman wished to marry Jadby, and as she was rich he was willing to do so. Then he decided to go to England and see if Sir Oliver, his father, remember, was keeping to his promise of leaving the money to his natural son. Madame Marie supplied the cash for Jadby to live in London, and brought him there in her yacht, the Canaro, commanded by Captain Bryson. And the yacht was anchored in the Thames until Madame sent it round at Jadby's request to Folkestone for the kidnapping," said Prelis. "I know all that, Mr. Martaban. Continue." The lawyer did so very willingly. For some reason, I know not why, seeing that she was wealthy, Madame Marie took to telling fortunes in the Bond Street establishment. Jadby, on the other hand, came down to see his father in this house and here fell in love with Miss Trent. He kept this secret from Madame Marie, naturally fearing what she would say, but she suspected something, and insisted upon coming down to see Sir Oliver, whom she had known in the South Seas. Madame learned that Lanwin was in favor of the match, and therefore set herself to work to thwart it by every means in her power. She implored Sir Oliver to allow Miss Trent to marry Shepworth here. "Thinking that we loved one another because of the sham engagement," said the barrister quickly. "Quite so, quite so," said Mr. Martaban, annoyed by the interruption. "I hinted at that before. However, Sir Oliver was bent upon his natural son inheriting the property and marrying his cousin, as Miss Trent truly was. Miss Trent refused, and Sir Oliver drew out a new will, of which Madame Marie knew. It confirmed the will made in Jadby's favor." "But what was the need of that?" asked Prelis, surprised. "Wasn't the first will good enough?" "Oh, yes, but as it had been made in the South Seas, Sir Oliver thought, very wrongly in a point of fact, that there might be some flaw. Now, Lord Prelis, you can see that if Jadby married Miss Trent, the elder woman would lose him." "Madame Marie, you mean?" "Yes, yes, I speak plainly, do I not? Well, then, if Jadby inherited the property, Madame Marie lost him all the same, as while he had money he would never marry her. She therefore decided to destroy the third will, which had not been signed, and to have Sir Oliver murdered." "Why didn't she stick him herself?" asked Prelis. "A strange woman," said the solicitor meditatively. "She would do much to gain her ends, even employing a third person to commit a crime, but for some feminine reason she would not stain her own hands with blood." "Rather a quibble." "It is, my lord, it is. However, to continue. As Mr. Haken wished to borrow money from Sir Oliver and consulted Madame Marie about the same, she used his confidence as a lever by which to obtain the leaves of the sacred herb from Dr. Horace. Before that time he had refused her, but he gave the herb to Mr. Haken. I don't know why." "I do," said Prelis below his breath, and thinking of the openly expressed hatred which Horace had proclaimed towards the dead man. Martaban took no notice of the interruption. "Mr. Haken got the herb and gave it to Madame Marie, who handed it to Sir Oliver on the day of the murder. As you know, Jadby and Shepworth quarreled on that day." "Yes," said Shepworth vigorously. "Jadby learned about my love for a certain lady, through Madame Marie, I believe, and threatened to make himself disagreeable. I gave him a black eye and myself a sprained ankle. Then the murder took place." "Yes," said Mordaunt, "and Mr. Hakin was in the library when—" "I know," interrupted Prelist sharply. "My uncle told me. But how did Madame Marie induce Steve to murder his master?" "It seems that she knew how Agstone was wanted for certain other murders in the South Seas," said Mordaunt, glancing at the papers. "So she threatened to have him extradited unless he did her bidding. He was, I regret to say, quite willing to do so, as he hated Sir Oliver, who treated him like a slave." "That," said Prelist emphatically, "I also know from Bryson. And then—" "Then, when Mr. Hakin retired, Sir Oliver burned the herb in a shallow bronze cup, the same as Mr. Shepworth saw in his flat, and went into a trance. Madame Marie had arranged with Agstone that he should watch at the window until Sir Oliver was insensible and then kill him. The man did so with the jade-handled paper knife." "Why wasn't Agstone stifled with the smoke fumes?" "Because the smoke had died away. When Sir Oliver was dead, Agstone heard a step, and after setting fire to some more leaves, he ran out of the window, not the one opened by Miss Trent, but another one. He watched and saw Miss Trent enter, saw also how she fainted with the acrid smoke. He entered and placed her in the armchair where she was found. It was then that Madame Marie came downstairs and into the room. She snatched up the third will, at which Sir Oliver had been looking, before manipulating the herb and tearing it up, flung it into the fire. Then she gave the will, leaving everything to Miss Trent, which Lanwin had also been looking at to destroy, I presume, to Agstone, and told him to take it up to his brother, Dr. Horace." "What for?" asked Prelist, surprised. "Madame Marie said she had no grudge against Miss Trent," explained Mordaunt, "and wanted the will placed safely out of Jadby's way so that Miss Trent might inherit and that Jadby might be kept poor." "One for Mona and two for herself," said Prelist grimly. "But who placed the knife in Mona's hand?" "Agstone, who hated her, did. A step was heard, that was Shepworth coming down, so Madame Marie ran out of the window and got back to her room by another door, which Agstone had left open. The man waited to smear Miss Trent's dressing gown with blood and to place the knife in her hand. Then Mr. Shepworth, so he says, secured the knife and—" "I know all that," said Prelist, "and understand the why and the wherefore of the first crime. But the second?" "That arose out of Jadby's hatred for Shepworth and his love for Miss Trent. Jadby learned the truth about the crime from Agstone, whom he found hiding in London under the protection of Madame Marie. He threatened to denounce him to the police to save Miss Trent, and then resolved to make use of him to incriminate Shepworth and at the same time to kill him, so that he might not come forward to give evidence against Miss Trent, which Agstone wanted to do." "But surely he would not have accused Mona of a crime which he had committed himself," said Prelist indignantly. "Yes, he would," said Ned quickly. "He hated Mona, and Sir Oliver, and Madame Marie, and Jadby, and everyone. The man was a Caliban. And to tell you the truth," added Shepworth candidly, "I don't think that his brother is much better." "Ah," said Prelist suddenly, "did Agstone confess the truth to Horace?" "No, he did not. He simply came and handed over the will as Madame Marie had instructed him, and then cleared out. He had to do what he was told, or else he would have been hanged." "Well, I see. Now the Alexander Mansions crime." Mordaunt went on again, glancing at the sheets. "Madame Marie learned about Mrs. Rover's dress and told Captain Jadby, so that he could get a double made, which he did." "Was she in favor of the second crime?" "Oh, no, for then Miss Trent would be set free to marry Jadby. She liked Miss Trent in a way, but did not intend her to be an obstacle." I don't believe that she liked Mona at all, snapped Preless irritably. She saved the second will so that Jadby might be made penniless, and would have stopped the second crime from being committed so that Mona might be condemned on Agstone's evidence. A wicked woman. She was all that, assented Mordaunt, but allow me to proceed. Madame Marie merely thought that Jadby wished to be disguised to meet Hakin, and told him about the dress, knowing that Hakin intended to remonstrate with Shepworth about his conduct. Which was perfectly correct, cried Ned indignantly. But why in a dress like Mrs. Rover's? Asked Preless, puzzled. Mordaunt scratched his head. I am not quite clear on that point, he declared. All I know is that Madame Marie wished to mix up things. I believe that she had some clearly defined scheme in her head, but what it was she did not explain. Nevertheless, you can see how Jadby came to the ball disguised. Yes, but how did Agstone enter? I can tell you that, said Shepworth, rising with a yawn. Jadby, as you know, called to see me early in the evening. I opened the door to him as the servants were out. He entered and I preceded him into the drawing room. He went back for his handkerchief, which he said he had dropped in the hall, and then must have set the door ajar. While I talked to him, Agstone entered and concealed himself under the dining table. Then Jadby went to the ball in his disguise. Agstone set the herb burning and stifled me, and afterwards admitted Jadby in his disguise. I was incriminated, you see, and Jadby, to make me quite insensible, lest I should see too much, waved the bronze cup under my nose. When I was completely insensible, he stabbed Agstone with a knife, which Agstone, having taken it from my desk, had intended to use on me. Finally, Jadby returned to the ball and concealed his dress in the cupboard in Rover's dressing room, which was used on that night as a cloakroom. Afterwards, he came down in a plain blue domino to clinch the fact that I had murdered Agstone. But you had bowled him out by then, Dory. There was a silence. A strange story, said Preless thoughtfully. Does Inspector Burge know it? Yes, and a carefully prepared account, suppressing certain facts, has been sent to the newspapers, said Mordaunt, folding up the sheets. You can be certain now, Lord Preless, that in 2 days all London will learn the truth, and that Miss Chint will be looked on as a martyr. Quite so, but I trust in a month or so she will be looked upon as my very dear and loving wife. Loud cheers! Cried Ned, adopting Preless's favorite expression. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All's well that ends well. The title of Shakespeare's comedy quite suited the present state of affairs at the Grange, seeing that the worst was over. Within a week everything was put straight. The inquests on Madame Marie, on Dolly Rover, and on Felix Jadby led to the disclosure of the whole strange story in the newspapers. Luckily, owing to the strong influence being brought to bear, the painful love story of Shepworth and Mrs. Rover was suppressed, and it was supposed that merely the desire to save Miss Chint had led Dolly to that lonely hut, where he met with his death. Indeed, the little man became somewhat of a hero, and, as the saying goes, nothing in life became him better than his manner of leaving it. The public followed his body to the grave with eulogistic comments, and Dolly's spirit must have smiled at the irony of the semi-public funeral. Jadby and the miserable woman who had loved him so dearly were buried quietly in the Folkestone cemetery. As to Bryson, he disappeared into the unknown, and nothing was ever heard of him again, which was just as well, as Preless had punished him in a measure by shooting him in the shoulder. But the whole affair was a 9 days' wonder, and those connected with it were glad when the excitement began to simmer down. It was annoying to have photographs of the Grange appearing in numberless illustrated papers, and still more annoying when the said pictures sent trippers across the downs to the lonely hollow. They came in shoals, in charabancs, in motor cars, in traps and carts, and riding on bicycles. But Martaban, who was taking charge of everything until his dear client became Lady Preless, instructed the police to keep the sightseers out of the grounds. Therefore these could only stare from the smooth heights of the downs into the woody hollow. And that was unpleasant enough to a couple of Arden lovers who found their wanderings in the enchanted gardens overlooked by kodak fiends, though heaven knows what kind of a picture these creatures hoped to obtain at such a distance. However, unless Mona and Preless took refuge in the woods or in the house, they had nowhere to go, for the lawns, girdled by trees, were quite open to the gazers from above. "I feel like a Christian martyr in the Colosseum," said Preless, when the sight of 3 bicycles, with 3 dismounting riders, sent them hastily into the drawing-room. "What an infernal nuisance it is to be kodaked to make a British holiday." "Never mind, darling," said Mona, taking his arm to lead him to a most comfortable window seat. "Let us sit here and talk. I have something to show you. Mrs. Rover sent it down. Look." Preless glanced at the near table and saw a shallow bronze cup of a somewhat graceful shape. "Is that the cup?" he asked, examining it. "Yes. Mrs. Rover found it in the cupboard. I expect Captain Jadby left it there along with the dress. It is rudely made, but pretty." It was indeed quaint, being of rough bronze, carved with hideous heads twined round with wreaths of some strange plant. Preless examined it closely. "By Jove, Mona," he said, "I believe these faces are wreathed with imitations of the sacred herb. See, the same spear-shaped leaves with the serrated edges. I wish we had some of the herb to compare." "I have," said Mona, going to a cabinet and pulling out a drawer. "I have just 1 leaf left." And she brought forward the purple withered leaf which, as Preless had pointed out, exactly resembled the chasings of the cup. "It must have come from Easter Island," said Mona, while the two bent their heads over it. "I never wish to hear of Easter Island again," said Preless, putting down the cup. "It has brought such misery." "Do you call me misery?" said Mona reproachfully. "Hasn't it brought me to you?" "Yes, in a way. But Lady Sophia is really responsible." "Jerusalem! Just fancy, Mona, dearest, she sent me to the New Bailey to find an interest in life and—" "And you have," said Mona, blushing and smiling. Preless said nothing but kissed her twice with a look which spoke volumes. "But I wish Aunt Sophia would be agreeable to the match," sighed the young man. "I am fond of Aunt Sophia, although she is such a worry. Besides, I want her to present you at court after our marriage." "Do you indeed?" said a complacent voice at the door, and the two looked up in great amazement to behold Lady Sophia standing there in the best of spirits and the most perfect of summer dresses. "I have stolen a march on you," said the lady, coming forward, "and waited for a dramatic moment upon which to enter. Your speech, my dear Preless, was a happy one, but I am not a worry." "Aunt Sophia, how did you come here?" "In a motor car along with Dr. Horace, who will soon be in. We left the car at the lodge keeper's. because the creature would insist that we were trippers wanting to see the house. Do I look like a tripper?" And Lady Sophia spun round for inspection. "You are a—" Preless stopped and glared. "I shan't say what you are until you tell me if you come in peace or war." For answer, Lady Sophia turned to Mona and took her to her breast. "My dearest girl," she said, smiling, "when you marry George Preless, you must really try and put some sense into his head." "Do you wish me to marry him?" asked Mona, rather scared. "Of course I do," cried Lady Sophia with asperity. "What else am I here for, you dear, silly, pretty, sweet, angelic darling?" "Hooray! Aunt Sophia! I endorse all the unnecessary adjectives, save the second." "You can take that to yourself, Preless. Now what am I?" "A weathercock," said her graceless nephew promptly, although she quite expected him to say something else. "You bully-ragged me about my marriage, and now you—" "Oh, I say," ended Preless in dismay, for Lady Sophia had burst into tears. "Whatever is the matter?" "I'm so wicked," sobbed the old lady, clinging to Mona. "Simon has told me all, and how very nearly he was being accused of murder. It was so lucky that his connection with this horrid herb thing was kept out of the papers, or else I never should have held up my head again. Oh, that I might have lived to see my husband in a nasty dock." "Don't trouble," whispered Mona, leading the old lady to the sofa. "It is all right. Mr. Hakin is in no danger." "And that being so," cried Preless indignantly, "he might have held his confounded tongue and not worried you." "My dear George," said Lady Sophia, wiping her eyes, "he did it for your sake. I was raging against the marriage, and he told me how nearly he had been an Old Bailey thing or a New Bailey creature. I forget which. I saw then how very easily one can be accused of things they hadn't the slightest intention of doing. And so I am here." "Kiss me, my love," cried Lady Sophia, again embracing Mona. "You are much, oh, ever so much, too good for Preless." "And I was too good for her some time ago," laughed Preless. "Aunt Sophia, you are a weathercock, but," he added, shaking hands, "I am glad that a kind wind has blown you round to being pleased. You are an angel." "I've been very horrid," said Lady Sophia penitently, "but I have made it up with everyone. Even with Constance, poor thing, although she did behave badly with that silly poodle creature." "He is dead, so let him rest, Aunt Sophia. And Constance has been punished, so don't blame her any more." "I am not blaming her. How silly you are, Preless. Don't I tell you that I've called to see her? She looks so well in her mourning, and so very happy. Mr. Shepworth is keeping away from her for a time, but they quite understand each other, and marry in a year. It will be a good match for Mr. Shepworth, for Constance will have all that poor thing's money. She won't have any bridesmaids, though, being a widow." Lady Sophia's discontented chatter was ended by the entrance of Dr. Horace, still gruff and untidy and aggressive. "Oh, here you are," said Lady Sophia, "looking more like a man out of the Stone Age than ever. I take him about as an illustration of the time when people lived in sweet little caves and wore sables all the year round." "Day, Preless," said Horace, taking no notice of Lady Sophia's babble. "How are you, Miss Trent? I have come to say good-bye. I can't stand this London rot, so I'm off again to the other side of the world." "Go to Polynesia and ask Bryson how his arm is," said Preless. "But I say, you treated me rather badly over this case." "Bosh! Pickles and fa de la!" snorted the traveler. Why, I gave you back the will, and did my best for Hakin's sake to keep you from going into the case." "Yes, yes," said Mona, jumping up to take Horace's hand. "I won't have him scolded." Horace grunted and disengaged his arm, in no wise impressed by the beauty of Mona. "Such a dear, delightful cave bear," sighed Lady Sophia on seeing this. But Dr. Horace's eyes were fixed greedily upon the bronze cup. "I see that you have the sacred herb burner of Easter Island," said he, fingering the bronze lovingly. "How do you know?" "I saw it there. I expect Jadby stole it." "This cup," said Horace, raising it aloft, "is thousands and thousands of years old. It is a remnant of Lemurian civilization. See how like these heads are to the heads of Easter Island statues, and the leaves of the herb are indicated. Give me this, Preless, and I'll take it back to those poor priests on the island. They will be delighted to see it again. It is used in their sacred ceremonies." Preless glanced at Mona. "What do you say?" he asked. "Mrs. Rover sent it to you, my darling." "Take it away," cried the girl, shuddering and spreading out her hands. "I never wish to see or hear anything of the sacred herb again. It has been a terrible time all through, but," she added, looking tenderly at Preless, "it has led to happiness." "I should like to see the herb," said Lady Sophia, coming forward with her lorgnette raised. "Dr. Horace, can you show it to me?" "No, I can't," growled the doctor. "I gave all I had to your husband." "There is one leaf left," said Mona, picking up the same. "Give me the cup, Dory. Have you a match?" "Don't send us into trances," said Preless jokingly. "I should love it above all things," said Lady Sophia. Mona laid the leaf on the bronze cup and lighted it. A thin stream of white smoke curled into the air, and while the two women and the two men stood back to avoid the fumes, a sickly scent of tuberoses spread through the room. The leaf fizzled into nothing, and Dr. Horace slipped the still warm cup into his capacious pocket. "That's the last of the sacred herb in England," said he, and without saying farewell trotted towards the door. There he stopped to wave a friendly hand, and departed en route to Polynesia and to Easter Island. Lady Sophia fell back onto the sofa. "I declare, this smell makes me quite giddy," she said, sniffing. "It's like funerals and coffins. I don't wonder people go into trances with it and see things." She bent forward with her lorgnette to her eyes and laughed. "I am in a trance now," she said gaily. I see the prettiest bride in the three kingdoms." "And the happiest bridegroom," said Preless, slipping his arm round Mona's waist. "And I see " "You see this," said Mona, and laying her arms about her lover's neck, she kissed him fairly on the mouth. "I think trances are quite improper," said Lady Sophia, rising. "My dear, if you will ask me to remain to dinner, I'll stop and talk over your wedding dress." End of chapter 27. Recording by Sharon Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas. End of The Sacred Herb by Fergus HUME.